scholar. The only thing I really learned was, damn, I don't know how to read. Because he spent actually an hour and a half on one sentence, the first sentence of the Republic. I said, damn, I don't know how to do. There's so much stuff hidden beneath the surface.
Well, my experience is not bad. I just know that it's dense.
Yeah.
It's so
Well,
dense. It's so dense, and given my pattern of learning and practice throughout my life, the learning is difficult.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And I've read a lot. In fact, I started reading this book, The Story of Philosophy by Will Durant. I read it twice.
Oh, yes.
And when I shut it, I said, what did I just read?
Yeah, there's a lot of very intelligent writers who write books that you can read at a blinding pace. And they're still informative, and you come away going, well, that was really rewarding. I really learned a lot. And then there's other people where you just have to take it one sentence at a time, because it's like, it's like Nietzsche. You can read Nietzsche quickly, but you can't understand Nietzsche quickly. He's like, having this internal struggle with his previous ideas. And if you don't know what the previous ideas were, you don't know why he's saying any of this or what he means by it. And
well, the Nietzsche graphic is fantastic.
nice.
I mean, it's got the best comics and all that, and lots of, these little things, these little boxes
Yeah.
that explains what he's saying. And I like it.
Can you hold up
because
the
I
cover?
Huh?
Can you hold up the cover? Is that Nietzsche for Beginners?
Yes.
Yes.
But I am a beginner. That's
Yeah.
all right.
I love the For Beginners series.
Yes.
Yeah. It's funny, in school, in elementary school, we're always taught that the things that are for beginners are an embarrassment, and you got to move past them and never go back. And if you go back, the implication is there's something wrong with you. But in traditional martial arts, the beginning stuff is what you go back to every single class. Like,
You
the
can
idea of not
embarrass
going
me.
back to the beginning is crazy. They think, well, you're obviously a terrible karate practitioner because you never go back and redo the beginning.
No.
So I'm struck by the difference between these two approaches to learning. So I have enormous respect for the beginning stuff and the fundamentals. That's the
Well,
whole.
I'm pretty hard to embarrass. So I am not embarrassed at all. I am the first one to say, I don't know. And I ask a question, even if it's a dumb question. There's no dumb questions in my estimation.
Right.
The only dumb question is the one you don't ask.
That's right.
well, Sharon,
Yes.
you seem to want to read philosophy in order to lead a philosophical life. Just always keep that in mind. You're not trying to become an academic philosopher or whatever so that you can give lectures or write papers or something like that, or argue fine points. So I haven't seen these materials, but if they are, what did Kierkegaard say, Kafka say, Nietzsche say about living? Or when you read even Aristotle, what's he saying about how do you go about living, and you'll do well.
Well, considering, go ahead. Sorry.
No, just if somebody throws out some technical argument, you can relate that to what you know and say, oh yeah, that's fine, but that's not living. We're not living a that's not for living a philosophical life. That's for arguing with some PhD in philosophy somewhere.
Oh, those guys. I have to leave them alone.
Well,
I just have to listen. Well, let me just say this. It's not so much to lead a philosophical life as to understand the life I've lived. It's been a very, very, very rich life, right?
Yeah.
And what I'm seeing from all these books I'm reading is that all these philosophers have opinions depending on the time period in which they lived. Like, I think, is it Heidegger? Heidegger was a Nazi. And I went, really? So it's mainly retrospective rather than prospective, because I think at this time in my life, I've got my morals and my foundation. I'm going to be 72 soon, very well anchored. But it's always good to add to that anchorage, to that, to that foundation. And that's what I'm doing.
Yeah. Well, you're following the recommendation of Kierkegaard, right? He notes we have to live life forwards, but we can only understand it backwards.
That's true. That's true. That's true.
I mean, it's one of my favorite of his quotes, because it never ceases to be relevant. Every day of my life, I run up against the problems of trying to do anything other than what's possible, according to Kierkegaard's dictum. You certainly, you can expend an enormous amount of energy trying to understand forwards and failing, just trying to guess what's going to happen. It's a fool's game, right? I mean, we see in the Iliad that Cassandra has the gift given to her by the gods that she can see forwards, but the curse is nobody's going to believe her. And the way that we tell this story as moderns is that it didn't have to be that way. We say it was the gods messing with they put their thumb on the scale to mess with her. But of course, that's not really the way the Greeks mean it. The way the Greeks mean it is the gods don't have to put their thumb on the scale at all. All she has to do is tell the truth about what's coming, and nobody would believe her. The future is always very surprising to us. We're like, we always think that our plans are going to work out and there won't be any negative consequences. And if someone comes along and says, well, actually, when you do that, here's what's going to happen. We're like, no, never.
But the way I see that, the way I translated that in medicine, and I think it probably in all organizations too, when an incident occurs, you have a thing that's called a root cause analysis.
Yeah.
Right? That's living life forward and understanding it backward.
Yeah, that's right.
That's exactly it. And so that's
right.
how my mind works.
Yeah.
That's what we were doing.
Yeah.
Well, you want to do lots of planning, Sharon, so that you'll know what's not going to happen.
our plans are like, it would be nice, but that probably won't be what happens.
Well, no matter how much you plan, how they say, man proposes, God disposes, right? So no matter how much planning you get, it's not a surety, it's not a certainty. The thing about uncertainty is you have to trust yourself and know that whatever the uncertainty is, you can adapt to it.
If you pay attention, yeah. So, I mean, this leads us right to this isn't the first sentence of paragraph 6, there's a couple sentences in, but this is the one that Sharon, you quoted last week towards the end of our seminar. I think that'd be a great place to pick up again this week, because there it is, a posteriori, right? Donald had this last week, and of course, that's just what you said, that we can't really understand it forwards. When we try to understand things a priori in advance of them, we're terrible at it, and the smarter we are, if anything, the worse we are at it, because now we can speculate out much further than people who aren't as smart, which means further from reality, right? The farther in the future we go, the less we know about what that's going to be like. But we can do it more persuasively with fabulous logical arguments about why it must be so. And of course, it isn't any more likely to be true just because a smart person said it than a stupid person. Right? I mean, a priori is a trap, right? It's a trap. And so, when he's saying that the Greeks looked a posteriori at human preference and self-limitation, he's saying they did something that is, on the one hand, the most realistic way to try to understand ourselves and the world is to look backwards. But it's also the least likely for people to do, because people are always trying to pretend that they can see the future or guess the future. So it's sort of amazing. When we talk about why do we study the Greeks, if we're not Philhellenes, if we're not in love with Greek society, why would we study them? And part of it is they were weirdos. I mean, let's just say it straight, right? They're weirdos. There's a lot of things about the Greeks that are strange, and one of them is that they, were willing to look backwards and say, let's see what we did and use that to figure out what's likely to happen rather than the other way around. People don't normally do that. And of course, the other really weird thing about the Greeks is that they essentially had no shame. Nietzsche talks about this. They would talk about the most heinous crimes that they committed during war, and they just say them. They wouldn't cover them up and lie about them and claim they didn't do them or any of that. They'd be just like, yeah, we razed the city to the ground, we murdered all the men, we raped all the women, and we sold everybody who was left into slavery, and that's what we did. And every culture since then has been busy going, no, no, we would never do that, even if that's exactly what they did. We're all busy covering things up and doing PR and spin. The Greeks are like, yeah, we were real shitheads. Don't mess with us. We're awful that way. So the result is when they testify about themselves, they're as likely as anybody else to be deluded, but they're less likely than most people to like lie about it. If they know they did something shitty, they're likely to just say, guess what we did? Hey, mama, welcome home. Guess what we did to the house while you were gone? They're not running around trying to cover it up or point at their sibling. They're like, we trashed the place. Isn't that cool? So it makes them really interesting to study here. And it means that when Kenneth is saying they look a posteriori at the results of human preference and self-limitation, he's saying they looked at it and then they told the truth about what they saw. Whether they were right or not about it, they at least were candid about it, which is a value that moderns don't have. Our value is, how do I make enough money to pay my rent? That's the value. And if I can do it by being candid, I might do it by being candid. But if I can do it by spinning a little bit and lying to myself and others and making myself seem better than I am, like on a resume, that's what most people do in the modern world. We don't have that value system that the Greeks had. There are shreds of it still around left over from traditional culture. This is something Kenneth Smith talks about a lot, and he will when we get to the section on modernity, that there are survivals of medievalism and even survivals of ancient or indigenous value systems that are still in shards and shreds within the matrix of modernity. And that's where people get this stuff when they read about King Arthur and say, I want to be candid, I want to be like a knight, that's a little survival of an old value system. But it's not the value system of modernity. The value system of modernity is, how much money do you have? And how can you get more? That's the core of it. Phil, you got your hand up. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think I asked a question. I'm currently attending a meetup group on Plato's Republic. And I think the question I asked them, and I'll ask you, is relevant to this issue. Okay. I was saying that while Plato was very, very much influenced by, of course, Socrates, he wrote about Socrates. So we could take it that whatever he spun has a lot to do with Socrates. But I sense that Plato also had in the background a lot of influence of Pythagoras. And I asked the question, like, because the concept of the Republic was the harmony of the soul. And I said, that sounds a lot like Pythagoras' concept of harmony. The problem is Pythagoras was both a mathematician and a mystic. So I asked the question, I said, which part of Pythagoras did he borrow into the divided line? Is it the mathematical one of the sum, the square of the hypotenuse equal to sum of the square of the two sides, okay, which is a mathematical equation, which is a kind of linguistic manifestation, which I think mathematics is. It's a very abstract linguistic thing. Or whether it's in the harmony of the melodies that produces overtones, and which is sort of much more mystical in a sense, because we certainly say that there was definitely in the modern context a great dispute about how should I say true harmony and let's see uh what is that, what that Bach did, what was that called now, let's see.
Talking about well tempering versus true tempering.
Well, yeah, well-tempered true harmony. Okay. And so we have it seems like the well-tempered harmony has been around for a while, and we adapted to it. And when we listen to a a, a band, a concert by the True Harmony, which is in the 17th century, it sounds off. Although it is true, right? It sounds a little bit off, like that. That's a
Right.
little weird. It's not like it's terrible. It's just like a little bit like, no, that. So if we're talking about a true harmony, then in some sense, the harmony would be distorted and it seems very real.
Yeah.
So I wonder, what is it? Is it this sort of like what Aristotle would call this harmony that produces the telos? Or is it more like the harmony that's in the mathematical equation? Because one is a linguistic uh, uh, problem, and the other one is sort of like more of a harmonic problem.
Right.
And so I know there's a close relationship in mathematics and music, but they're different. Could you say something about that? Because that really sets Plato uh, in a funny relationship to Aristotle, and that might be a funny relationship in that particular moment that is still existing with us today. And I think that gets at the issue that what we're talking about.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, this is something I'll be able to talk about better by the end of the year than I can talk about now. This is my year to go back and reread all of Plato. I can say a little about it. I can say, among other things, that Cornford's book, which I just finished, has very interesting things about the Pythagoreans and Plato. And he, for example, divides Plato's dialogues into two groups. And the first group is the early dialogues before a certain event happened in Plato's life. Cornford is postulating, and the rest of the dialogues are after that event. And the event was when he went to, was it Sicily, to interview, to have discussions with some of Socrates' other students, and discovered that they were all Neo-Pythagoreans, and they interpreted everything Socrates had said from a Neo-Pythagorean perspective. And so Cornford says Plato went back home and started writing a new round of dialogues. And in these dialogues, Socrates says some things differently than what he says in the first set of dialogues. And they're much more concerned with Pythagorean concepts of the soul and harmony and so forth. So that's going to, I think, inform the way I go about reading them this year, as I'm going to try to read the early ones first, the pre-Pythagorean Plato first, and then preferably in good translations and with interesting commentary, and then follow up with the Pythagorean stuff. But in general, well-tempered versus true-tempered, one of the things Kenneth Smith would talk about here is this way in which human beings have this incredible capacity to acclimate ourselves to things. And we can acclimate ourselves to anything and convince ourselves that it's not only normal, but healthy and good. So you can get people who poison themselves on a regular basis, and the whole time they're doing it, they think, this is the secret to health and long life. And they just, if you took away the poison, they'd be like, well, this doesn't taste good anymore. It can't possibly be healthy. Where's all that healthy flavor that I know is the source of health and long life? And the answer is none of it is any of those things. You just got used to it. And because you're familiar with it, you've, as Kenneth says, you've given it your family scent. By you becoming familiar with it, you've rubbed off your scent on it, and now it smells like it belongs. It's part of your little claustral envelope of everything here has to smell like me, and I don't like things that are too different. And it's weird because we can get used to anything, even a bad harmony. We can even get used to dissonance and think that's the very perfection of harmony itself. It's not a challenge for this weird apparatus that we've got that Hegel writes about. So I think you're putting your finger on a critical issue, and it's an issue that runs throughout this entire book and pretty much everything Kenneth ever wrote. Is that in the hippie movement in the 60s, there was a belief that Western civilization was too artificial, and we were living artificial lives, and we were concerned with things that weren't actually good for us. And it was part of the back to nature craze that the hippies adopted, was this idea that if we would stop being so artificially conditioned and learn to listen to our feelings and to our inner nature, we could live a healthier life. And a lot of things came out of that. There were, I mean, an enormous number of consequences to people who grew up in that movement. I was a child of two parents, one of whom was a hippie. So I got a full dose of this stuff. And, you know, part of where it goes right is it teaches you to question your acculturation and say, how do I know that something's healthy just because I'm used to it? But it substitutes a different dogma. And that dogma is, if it tastes good to me, it must be healthy for me. And so suddenly you just fall prey to junk food, like on a level never before seen by artificially constrained, uptight Victorian people. They were trying to do what was proper, and I'm instead giving in to every addiction, every piece of junk food because it feels good. If it feels good, it must be good, right? So these issues of human existence and why is it that a cow can tell what plants are good for it, but a person can't tell what foods are good for us? What happened to us that we can't trust our inner intuition to be a guide to health? This is a pretty serious and dangerous business, these questions.
Well, the primal scream lost me.
Right? I mean, everyone could sense something's wrong, but the recipes for how to fix it were equally bad. So it's like, okay, I did throw out the bathwater, but unfortunately the baby went with it. And now I have a new baby with a new load of bathwater. Crap. So yeah, the well-tempered clavier. I listen to Bach's well-tempered clavier a lot. It's quite enjoyable. It's a masterwork of simple piano composition. But I always find myself wishing that somebody equally good would compose an equally comprehensive suite of sonatas called the true tempered clavier, so that we could listen to the differences side by side and try to figure out what has happened to our hearing of harmony as a result of being raised on well tempering, which is a convenience, right? The whole point of well tempering is it's a convenience. It's a distortion, but it's a convenience, much like most of modern civilization. It's a great question, Phil. Thank you. Stephen, what's on your mind?
Well, seems largely this section is, we have a current sort of delusion in the world about equality. They're throwing this word around in a crazy fashion. And Smith seems to be saying that, well, no, sorry, that's not the case. I'm sorry. I have to... now he was dealing with this sort of crisis was arising around 2000, wasn't he? Where everyone was panicking. Maybe our date system is about to go down or something. So somehow this whole business was a little bit of a response to that. Now we have a broad media which is pushing this word equality, and Smith saying, sorry, no, you get it's a complex question, very complex. Now, another thing he's saying about the Greeks, of course, is they pursued excellence. It was a simpler world back then. You didn't have computers, you didn't have any of this modern junk, especially computers. We have a lot of sort of complexities. It's sort of true in a way the Greeks, on a certain level, lived a simpler life. The issues were easier to see. We're stuck with an enormous amount of categories compared to what the Greeks were dealing with. Because they didn't have those categories, they could see certain realities which have been obscured for us. So that's the other question. It's the pursuit of excellence, but there seems to be a move going around today. It says you are excellent from the word go.
We have an inalienable right to be excellent.
Yeah, and it looks like we've come to the point, especially in relation to the US, where we're playing a dangerous game. Because you've got buttons which are very dangerous in the modern world. And the media is telling everybody to be a kid. As for the hippies, well, the generation prior to World War II was struggling to get food on the table. There weren't that many fat people before World War II. And then came the great material bouncy of the post-war period, and they had the spare time to be hippies. And of course, they became enormous hypocrites. They had that luxury. I mean, the hypocrites, the hippies, I'm starting to mix the names up now, railed against previous generations without understanding them. And within a very short space of time became history's greatest materialists. Began by condemning materialism only to become the greatest materialists that were ever, to a point where the older generation was really wondering and saying to the hippies, hey guys, you should have some values. I know we were a generation that was about trying to make a living, but guys, don't desert all values, which is what the hippies started doing. Something weird's going on here, but this whole section is dealing with this question of equality, and sorry guys, it just doesn't work that way. You can't necessarily achieve a full doctorate as soon as you sign the paper. It takes years.
Right. Well,
Okay,
if you do, then the doctorate's not worth anything suddenly, right? I mean, there's this idea of discrimination as being critical to the adult mind, is something that is hard to sustain when everybody's saying that we all have an inalienable right not to be judged and to be excellent. And we're excellent from the get-go. We're free. All the difficult battles have been won. Here's your prize. Welcome to the world. Here's your prize. Enjoy. And the importance of that, the value of that approach is that it turns everybody into fodder for con men, right? To learn not to discriminate, to learn that everybody's equal and everybody's nice means that if you're nice, that must mean that carnival barker over there is also nice. He's not going to do anything to you that you wouldn't like. And the skeevy man who lives next door, who invites little children over, he must be just as nice as Martin Luther King. Everybody must be equally good. I learned the hard way, having been raised to see everybody as intrinsically good. I learned the hard way how many people there are who are con men and dangerous, because everything that I'd been taught from the hippie upbringing prepared me to be a victim of this enormous array of predators who are always around and with us in society and always looking for someone to con or otherwise take advantage of. So I really, as much as I appreciate the good sides of hippie culture, which we could talk about some other time, I also really appreciate the bad sides and the dangers inherent in that, don't judge anything, don't be judgmental approach. It's too simple-minded, and it sets the world up for catastrophe.
Well, that's the modern humanist perspective. People are essentially good. Pick up a human, throw them somewhere, and like a cat, they're always going to land on their feet.
Right. Right. And
No,
that
it
doesn't prepare us
way.
doesn't prepare us to understand all the counterexamples around us. So I'm with you, Stephen. I mean, this is what we see over and over. And in the modern world, we keep seeing these movements to fix what's broken, and the movements themselves invariably not only fix some things, but also break a whole bunch of other things. They go into these things with these simple-minded ideologies that are easy to remember or put on a bumper sticker, but don't actually work well in real life for figuring out what to do. It's a
Yeah, so the impression you get with Spengler when he's sort of telling the Nazis, you're running around the streets smashing shop windows. Why are you wrecking your own civilization? Doesn't make sense. This isn't civilization.
right,
You've lost one of the essentials.
right.
They didn't pick up on this. This is a problem with what was essentially a populist movement. We had the collapse of the previous system, which was a sort of aristocracy, replaced on with many different types of popularism.
Yeah,
And they didn't understand the subtleties of running a civilization. That just seemed to be the thing.
yeah, yeah. Anyway, it's an excellent point, Stephen. Thank you. Yeah, it's this is something that people aren't really going to be comfortable with. But I mean, the rise of the hippie idealism goes hand in hand with the rise of serial killers in the Pacific Northwest. We had a bounty of serial killers, and that was because we had a bounty of clueless people who were wandering around thinking everybody was nice. Ted Bundy, the Green River Killer, Einhorn. These guys used to prey on sweet young things who thought everybody was nice. It wasn't when we see the Hollywood depiction, they always say, "Oh, it's prostitutes." We're still stuck with the Jack the Ripper idea of serial killers. But I mean, I know people who were killed by Ted Bundy, and many of them were not prostitutes or anything of the kind. They were just sweet young things who've been raised to think everything's great and the world is nice and no one's ever going to hurt you. And that made them the perfect victims. Just like I was raised to be the perfect victim before I got lucky enough to figure it out before anything irreversible happened to me. But I had a lot of close calls when I was a kid. I was nearly molested multiple times. I was just very lucky that something worse didn't happen to me. I was hanging around with ex-cons and drug addicts and all kinds of people. That was the sweet world we were trying to make, is not judging anybody. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I'm still puzzled as to why your parents, having understood that physis is the source of truth, confuse that with taste, I guess, or whatever. I mean, I guess you can take all of these little phrases and read them strangely. Plato deals with something similar with that when he's trying to make distinction between being and appearance. And he uses the dietitian versus the chef. The dietitian tries to make the food good for you, and the chef tries to make you like to eat it. I don't, it's a second order thing. From all these little aphorisms, well, maybe they're not really aphorisms, but given a wise person or a fairly aware person that has some understanding, sees the weakness immediately and steers away from it. And yet the other person sort of adds these up. They go right up there on the list with a stitch in time saves 9 and all the other little phrases. If it feels good, it's good for you.
Right.
Well, it can be.
Might be.
Might be.
It's not that it's definitely not. It's not that simple.
No. And I just, this is a thing about kind of that hits it at philosophical living, that produces the kind of questioning and understanding
Yes.
that allows you to sort of sort through these things. I mean, I'm sure any one of the hippies of the 70s, and I wasn't really one, I was one of the geeks of the 60s and 70s.
Yes.
But if you'd have taken a moment, could have sat down and come up with a counter example in less than a minute, and it never happened.
Yeah, well, because it's ideologically not allowed.
Right.
You're supposed to ignore those things. Don't think about them. Don't
You
talk
know,
about them.
that's like there's an example in Plato where somebody says, right is the power of the stronger. The right might is right. And Socrates says, well, so and so is the greatest wrestler in Greece. He's won, 4 consecutive Olympic wrestling titles, and he likes to eat meat. Does that mean that we should all eat meat? Is
Right.
that because that's the interest of the strongest? That's what the strongest man in Greece likes.
You must be right.
Must be right. If you believe that might makes right, then
No
what
one's
the
mightier than
mightiest
that,
man believes must be right.
That's right.
And you really should sort of, I think, accumulate a whole sack of these little counter examples.
That's what we need.
And so when somebody who's very erudite, overeducated to the point that they can believe these little things, you can just pull out have something like that and say, no, I don't think so. I can't really argue with you on some esoteric level, but just at the simple level, it doesn't make sense.
That's right.
You begriff or whatever.
Yes.
Okay. Go back.
Okie doke. Thanks, Donald. That was a good point. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I have to sort of defend equality to a certain degree. I mean, like, all depends. I mean, the fact that we have a class system, that's okay as long as it's permeable. In other words, you can move up and down, no problem. The problem is that it seems almost evident that it might be hardened more and more into a caste system. And a caste system in which then you're bound by your birth. And that's not a democratic ideal in any sense. I remember I was recently, well, actually a couple of months ago, in a meetup, a live meetup in this case, called Civilized Conversation. And there was a very, very smart Indian American guy that was there. He was Indian and he immigrated. And we were talking about democracy. And he says, instead of casting your vote, vote your caste. he, he, he flipped those around in a sense. I don't know whether that was, in a sense, an attempt to emphasize the development of the caste system, and therefore, in a sense, you should go with your caste and therefore break the anti-democratic ideal, or whether that was an extension of a funny kind of democratic idea in which you're just going to vote your economic status and that's it, and which is sort of anti-democratic in that sense. So I thought that was very clever. I complimented for him twisting those words around. Cast your vote. Don't cast your vote. Vote your cast. So I just wanted to point that out, that there is a very, very distinct difference between a class system and a caste system.
Thank you.
That's it.
I appreciate it. So let's go to the text then, because this is right on. This is what he's talking about here. Like we pointed out at the beginning of this session, he's talking about the Greeks looking a posteriori at human nature and the consequences of human choices, rather than looking a priori. And that all by itself is it's a natural thing. It's a natural faculty that we have to be able to do that. But we are frequently acculturated in such a way that it becomes contra-natural to the artificial nature that has been cultivated within us to look a posteriori. We get cultivated to instead look at everything a priori with our ideologies and our thought-terminating cliches and the whole armament of interpretive lenses. And it gets treated as completely, obscene and abnormal to look at things without that proper set of values that our culture tells us that we must use in our interpretation. And so the Greeks, never, they weren't superhuman. They weren't able to look without any lenses at all. That's not what Kenneth's saying. But relative to us, relative to moderns, Kenneth will say it in the later chapters. Moderns are the most ideologically marinated people who have ever existed in the history of the world. And if it sounds like an extreme claim, you just have to think about industrialization and science. Nobody has been as industrialized as we are. And we know from the archaeological evidence, the number of machines that we use in our lives, the amount that we harness electricity, that's all well beyond what anybody else has ever done. And the point that he makes is that among those sciences and technologies that is deployed in our everyday lives relentlessly is PR. We are endlessly subjected to crafted messages designed to affect our thinking. The way that we have mass education, the way that we have mass entertainment, the way that we have mass consumption of news media, political campaigns, all of these things are designed to ensure that we never look at anything a posteriori, that we, in fact, we lose the capacity. Our thinking is so dependent on these cognitive prostheses to think for us and reach conclusions for us, to minimize the amount of time we spend looking at things and feeling like we just can't understand them. And instead, we're encouraged to think we can understand everything. All we have to do is be logical, follow from the premises, the lines of thought that have been taught to us by example, through media, through news, through education. And then we will be good enough. We will fit in to society. We won't rock the boat too much. We'll be able to get a paycheck. That means we won't be homeless. That means that we won't die young, and be sick and miserable on our way to the early death. Now, there's serious stakes here that keep us focused on trying to be ideologically conformant while denying to ourselves that any of that is happening. All of this is caught up in this sentence. When he's saying they looked a posteriori, part of what he means is they didn't have the science or the technology or even the interest in mass indoctrination that we take for granted as the norm. And we take it for granted so much that we call it freedom, not mass indoctrination. We think that education frees you. But by education, we mean getting you to think pretty much the same way everybody else does so that you can hold down a job. We don't tell ourselves that's what we mean, but when push comes to shove and when we're, with the rare exceptions of weirdos like Phil, when we look at what college degree do we want to get, most of us are asking ourselves, well, how much money will I make? And is it enough to pay my rent? It's the weirdos who say, I want an art degree. I want a philosophy degree. I know I'm going to be poor, but my soul is called by this thing. So I'm going to do this thing. That's why in our society, people mock philosophy degrees and English lit degrees and history degrees. They say, you obviously didn't want a job. This is what we say. This is all the kids say it. This is what all the kids in college say. And this is what people say later on. And they say it because it's so widely accepted, even though we don't really want to admit to ourselves what that says about us, because we're supposed to be the best and the brightest, not the most indoctrinated. So a posteriori, the Greeks looked. It was a completely alien world to ours. I'll tell you a little story. I went to Amsterdam just once. A friend of mine loved Amsterdam, liked to go there. He liked the marijuana back before legalization, and he liked the prostitutes. And he liked the overall feel of freedom in the city, which he associated with his ability to do those two things. And I went along with him, not because I wanted either of those things. I really didn't and don't. But because I had never been to Amsterdam and I'd traveled a lot for work, but only a little bit internationally, it seemed like an opportunity. I went to Amsterdam, and among the things I learned is There's all kinds of laws that the United States has that they don't have. You know why people don't go running around in the park naked in Amsterdam? It's not because they'll get in trouble with the police. They won't. It's because they don't want to run around naked in the park. That's why they don't do it. In the United States, we have laws to keep you from doing it. You'll be punished. I mean, you know, it'll go on your permanent record. You're some kind of pervert. You can't be trusted. Don't give this guy a job. We like, until we experience what it's like to go somewhere where all of these victimless crimes aren't classified as crimes by the law, we don't realize the extent to which we've been acculturated to a heavy hand dominating our choices at all times, 24 hours a day. And because we don't think about that, because that's the water we swim in, it means we're not aware of how many of our 7 plus or minus 2 conscious registers at all times are not busy helping us solve the problem at hand. They're busy keeping an eye out for whether we're going to get in trouble. Americans don't want to get in trouble, just like Germans in the 1930s didn't want to get in trouble. We're very similar that way. We know what happens to people who get in trouble. So we won't look at things a posteriori the way the Greeks do. We look at things a priori, which means ideologically. We have a rich orchestra of thought-terminating cliches at our disposal to help us not think about things, so that those things will think for us and give us the answers. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I have something to say about this. It's like, but first with a little story to begin, and then what I really want to say is like when I was teaching in Kansas State, that was still sort of toward the beginning of my teaching. There was a very interesting student who was graduating at that time, and she had the very clever idea of, let's say, taking a survey in which she asked a question about people who pass by, to write down what she should do with her life now that she's getting a degree in art. She was particularly, I guess, amused. I wouldn't say upset, but amused by one of the answers. It says, now that you graduated a degree in art, you should shoot yourself in the head, which is essentially what you're sort of saying. And she was, you know, I would say kind of pleasantly pleased that somebody was so honest about it. And so that's a statement that really is true. You know, most people would think that way, except most people would be too polite to just say it outright. The question I really want to ask is that I wonder whether this is due to the fact that the linguistic necessity of our culture, of culture in general, is by its very nature restricting the possibilities, because we depend on language so desperately. In fact, it's hard for me to think without using words, right? I sometimes I try, like sometimes in painting, it is possible to get somewhere, but you know, that in a way is a kind of language, is kind of a messed up language. That's all. And to the degree that we have it, it's almost as if that ability of the mind naturally gravitates to language in some form. Okay, it doesn't have to be a hardened form like an absolute thing, but because of that, you know, even Heidegger, who sort of like has a funny relationship with that, says, you know, language is not being, but it's the house of being, right? That's where being lives, in the house, and that house is language itself. And so if that's the case, it almost seems like we have a structure, an ontology in which there may be a deeper grounding than language, but language forms a very, very important network, a net that is a kind of secondary grounding that we need to penetrate to go beyond language. Not that language is not functional, clearly is, you know, whether it's mathematics or, you know, a formal language like English or anything else. because we need it so much to function. So in that degree, it's almost as if it's not diabolical. That is part of our nature. And if that's part of our nature, it's almost like, well, how do you go against your own nature? Because
Right.
that is human nature.
Right.
That may not be the nature of a rose. I mean, you could talk to a rose, and some people think that a rose will be hearing you, but it's not its nature. Its nature is driven by a kind of telos that does not have a language. It has something else going on for it. So if that is ourself, how can we say that we are our own human bondage?
Yeah.
And so that's a real problem. I mean, I desperately need language,
Yeah.
and some people put it in such a high level. Like, I always wonder, I mean, I'm not a Derrida scholar. I kind of wonder whether he's saying that is actually the structure of being, or whether he is using it to, in a sense, deconstruct language. I can't even decide, what he's doing, but he seems to be attacking it on a certain level that either is like underscoring that actually is the grounding, or actually, no, that's not the grounding. I'm deconstructing it to go beneath it. So, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a problem that we can't escape from because it's us
Yeah.
because we need it,
Yeah,
just
we
as
do.
much as food.
It's a
So,
huge problem.
yeah, how do you get away from that? That's it.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, it's one of the critical problems to what extent are we dependent on that, and for good and for ill. And, you know, our ideologies and thought-triggering cliches don't like it when things are both true and false. They don't like it when things are good and bad. We want zero-dimensional thinking. You get to the point and you're done. And the whole point of the thinking is to get to the right point. And if you get to the wrong point, you're in trouble. Nobody wants to be in trouble. So we want these simple paths and simple answers. And instead, we find right down into the very core of our species is this dependency upon a capacity that is a two-edged sword. It is as much a curse as it is a blessing. It is a blessing. I mean, it's not that this adds up to nothing. It's a massive blessing, but simultaneously, it's a massive curse. So what the hell are we supposed to do about that? Well, any good answer to that question starts by admitting there's a question, and we don't want to do that. Moderns are like, no, none of this is a problem. The human mind is great. Stephen talks about this a lot. We have this idolization of human faculty and human intelligence. We say, it can't possibly be the case that our core nature is this conflicted and ambivalent, that we've got this massive problem right at the heart of our thinking. Because if that were true, well, that invalidates all of modernity. Everything we're trying to do is on a bad foundation, if that's right. So, it's easier to just tell ourselves, I must be wrong, because that sounds like a lot of work, and I don't want to do that work. So, it must not be true, and I'm going to try not to think about those questions anymore. So Kenneth says there's a reason why moderns are so anti-philosophical. This philosophy asks all the questions we really don't want to ask and we don't want to think about. So, yeah, Phil, I think that's right on the money. We'll be exploring this extensively as we go. But I mean, if Hegel's right, and not necessarily in literally what he said, but in the implications of what he said, then one of the, I can't call it an antidote, but let's say one of the treatments for excessive distancing from reality through the medium of language would be to live a life in which there are significant parts of that life that are as hands-on with the natural real world as possible, because it won't lie to us. We might lie to ourselves about what we're seeing, but it will give us a steady input reminding us that things are not the way we conceive of them. And that will make us challenge the assumptions that our language and ideology suggest to us. Whether it's gardening or it's painting or it's karate or whatever it is, it has to be something in which there is a strong component of the real world that's inescapable, that's just in your face all the time, so that you have as many opportunities as possible. It's when we start living lives more and more divorced from that feedback loop, the samanthasy with the laws of nature, that it encourages our worst tendencies to escape from the real world into the idealized world of noesis. And, that's when language becomes more of a curse than a blessing. The more that it's tethered to the concrete realities and their consequences, the more language leans into its blessing side. Although that too can become a curse if it goes too far. I mean, it's a dialectic. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, it seems one of the great dangers in the present epoch is that of the hidden persuader, the mass advertising that we're facing now. You don't have a class in school where the teacher, stands up the front. Hi, kiddies. This morning I'm going to teach you about advertising, and writes in big letters on the board, remember it's BS. Remember when you see an ad, let that little red dot start flashing which says BS. Every time you see an advertisement, let that little red light go, BS, BS, BS. Every time you see a fabulous slim model up on that board saying, wear this, it's BS, they will try to sell you stuff. Now, ancient Athens probably had its huge share of con men. They didn't have the tools they have today. Their cons were a bit simpler. In the end, they got found out pretty quickly and everyone had the word on them. But today, I mean, today these corporations, they seem to have no shame. When they get caught out, they go, so what? Just ignore it.
Right. What are you going to do?
Just
What are you
keep
gonna do
on
about
going.
it? Nothing.
Just keep on going through, guys. But yeah, there's this huge loss with people when they see these seductive images, they're being told what they want to hear.
Right.
And this is a danger. But this isn't taught in school. Hey, kiddies, this is BS. You're being told what you're being given a seductive image. We like to be seduced, but watch out.
Yes.
But this isn't being said today, is it?
Yes. Major problem. So I put a link there to a 1933 Michael Curtis film, Mystery of the Wax Museum. It's not fully black and white and it's not fully color. It's two-strip, not three-strip, two-strip Technicolor. It was red and green. And they used red and green to make all the colors in the film. And I got to say, the first time I watched it, which was last year during the pandemic, I watched it on the Criterion channel, and they had a nicely, beautifully restored copy of it. It took me some time to understand I didn't know it was two-strip Technicolor when I started watching it. At first, I'm like, wow, the lighting is really unusual in this film. It's very odd. Anyway, you should check it out if you've never seen it before. It's pre-code Hollywood film, and that means that it has a number of themes in it that would not be allowed just a few years later. And I'm going to talk about those for a second because they tie right into this opening sentence here. One of the key issues in the movie is that the henchman or malefactor who is securing victims for the Wax Museum. I mean, you guys have probably seen the Vincent Price one from later on. There've been a number of remakes. That the henchman is a drug addict, and that's how he's being controlled. He can only get access to his drug from the villain if he does the villain's bidding. And even though he potentially could be a better person, he can't because of his addiction. His desire has leashed him into behavior that he finds disgusting and reprehensible. He hates himself, but he can't stop doing it because he wants what he wants. And this is the only way to get what he wants. So when they remade it was a hugely successful film, by the way, and it invented the genre of the woman investigative reporter. So if you guys have seen His Girl Friday from some years later, the black and white film, which is incredible, it's a riot. That film was a direct descendant of Mystery of the Wax Museum. The lead character in that film was a kind of upgraded version of the heroine in Mystery of the Wax Museum. There's really interesting film history here. So because it was so popular, of course it got remade during the Hays Code era. But the issue became that under the Hays Code, you were not allowed to depict addiction. I mean, somebody could be a drunk, but not a drug addict. Drug addiction was taboo. You were not supposed to mention it. This was an era when they thought monkey see, monkey do. You know, if you show somebody doing an action and they get their head chopped off, instead of the Hayes censors thinking, well, that'll teach people not to do that thing, they all freaked out and said, oh no, you showed him doing it. Now everybody will want to do it. And other people are like, yeah, but he got his head chopped off. Wouldn't most people say, well, I don't think I want that result? And the Hayes censor said, no, no, you can't show the thing. So even though in Mystery of the Wax Museum, we see this brilliant depiction of the way that desire, it becomes a form of slavery for us when it rules over us. The Hayes censors thought the clever thing to do was to not teach that lesson and to just cover up that there was any such thing as addiction at all. So in the remake, it's an alcoholic, which of course was acceptable under the Hayes Code because, I mean, everybody was an alcoholic back then. So, you know, they didn't see it as particularly interesting. They thought it was okay. You could show that. But it means that the remake is missing this sting of moral education about the dangers of people who offer you what you want, what you think you want, and that you can be led by the nose by this. You know, this opening sentence says, looked a posteriori at the aggregate results of human preference and self-limitation. Human preference and self-limitation. This is that thing Heraclitus talks about. It would not be better for people if they got exactly what they want. Even if they got exactly what they want, it would not be better. Because the things that it's hard to fight impulsive desire, right? We would give up our soul, we give up our character to get what we want. Because that's how strong desire is in Homo sapiens. That's what Heraclitus is warning us. It's what the Greeks are warning us. They're all warning us that you cannot be a free person and also be relentlessly chasing after the things that you desire. It makes you a slave. No one has to put you in shackles. You've shackled yourself. You have created your own bondage to this thing. And now that thing is a leash dragging along the ground behind you, waiting for anybody to come along and pick it up. And then they've got you, because you will do anything to get your desire. So the Greeks are looking at this, and they're seeing that when people are slaves of their desire, they will think anything that they have to think in order to justify getting what they want. I mean, the Greeks used to believe that the testimony of a slave was invalid in court. And you couldn't have a Greek testify you couldn't have a slave testify in a court of law, because they would be all concerned with how do they get what they want and how do they avoid getting in trouble. And they wouldn't say the truth. They would say what they thought would get them out of trouble. Or they would say what they wished to be true rather than what was true. Or in the case of Banausoi, the other form of slavery, they would say what they had been ideologically conditioned to assert is true rather than what's actually true. But in all of these cases, we have these powerful forces drawing us away from being candid on the one hand, but also truth-seeking on the other. But what good is it for somebody to be candid if their head is full of bullshit? If they persuasively share with you their bullshit, there's a hazard that now you'll believe the bullshit if you overvalue candidness. So candidness and truth-seeking have to be seen as two separate things, and they both are equally important to have any chance for somebody's testimony to be meaningful at all. This is an example of what they're talking about here. They're saying, if people are like this, what would happen to our courts of law if we pretended that people weren't like that? What if we pretended that everybody's equal and everybody cares about the truth, and all they have to do is raise their hand and swear an oath, and now suddenly they all become both candid and truth seekers? The Greeks are like, there's no evidence of that. The evidence is the contrary. At least 2/3 of people are going to be sharing bullshit with you, either because they're lying to you or because they believe the bullshit themselves. You can't let them anywhere near the reins of society, or it's going to be disastrous for society. This is what he's talking about here. And he's saying it's not that you impose that on somebody else or project it onto them. If you are as careful as you possibly can be to remove all the filters you can and to see the person the way that they actually intrinsically, essentially are, kata fuse, according to nature, you will find a diversity in people, not a homogeneity. when it comes to relationships to the truth, you will find a diversity, and it's not an infinite diversity. It's that people fall into just a handful of different types of relationships to the truth. And along with that, they have only a handful of relationships to morality, whether they care about the common good, whether they care about what's healthy or not for society. And that the majority of people don't care what's healthy for society. They care what is good for them personally or what is approved by their ideology, depending on which flavor of slave they are. And that's all that they can care about. Maybe they'll grow out of it someday. He's going to talk about this in the sentences ahead. I mean, we don't know. Different people have different teleologies, different natures, different hidden seeds waiting to unfold. But plenty of people never get out of these stages, no matter how many opportunities you give them. They cling to these stages of development. Pretending that they don't just sets up a catastrophe. This is the core of what he's talking about in section G. If this is the nature of human beings, that we fall into these different epistemological and axiological species, then society should be organized to deal wisely with these different species and not pretend they don't exist. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was thinking recently, once again, I was in the Plato's Republic relationship, and I was thinking how deeply, in spite of the fact that I now developed some qualms about Plato, one thing I really admire him is how deeply he understood human psychology. Maybe he's the first true human psychologist, although he didn't call himself a psychologist, obviously. And I was thinking recently of the American Constitution. That's kind of like based on the psychology in a way. I mean, not the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. So, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that, that divine being allow us to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness sounds very, very much like the tripartite soul of Plato, right? I mean, life being kind of being, I guess, the harmony of being. Liberty sounds like spirit, the desire to move and change things and do things. And the pursuit of happiness sounds like what? Appetite, right? I mean, it's right there, like in our Constitution, that in a sense, the language so almost parallel. Now, I myself actually believe in the French thing. I don't exactly have the quotes, but it seems like life, liberty, and fraternity, which sounds more like Hegel.
Liberté, égalité, fraternité.
That's right. So in some sense, it's kind of like, yeah, he's already dealing with psychology. I guess the French is more like social psychology or something. So yeah, like he get down to in a sense, the meat of human nature in a deep sense, right? I mean, why did he just divide it into tripartite, rather than a quadrant or whatever? It's like, yeah, I think those are pretty basic parts. And so, yeah, and I think we are maybe too much ruled by our appetites. Thanks to Benedict Bentham, it's like, yeah, and all of that stuff, I mean, even John Locke, property and all that. It's like all that has to do with appetite, and I think we're too motivated by that, and certainly capitalism is that way too. And I'm not sure humanity in general isn't motivated by the short-sightedness of appetite. So yeah, that is a problem, and I think he put his finger in the centrality of that problem of human nature. All right, that's it, Phil.
Thanks, Bill. So yeah, let's run with this sentence. So, these are the issues that we're talking about in this sentence. They're saying if you're able to look without ideological filters, which none of us is able to do, but if you're able to look with fewer ideological filters, the less filters you use, the fewer filters you use, the more you look at the actual nature of people as expressed over time, like thousands of years, what have people done? The more the Greeks believed, you see these characterological species, and they're distinct. And some people go through developmental processes of passing from one to the next to the other, but other people get stuck and they stay at one of those stages and they don't go any further. And the question is, well, then what sort of society are we to create given this diversity? It's like, for us, this is a fraught question because we do look with ideological, huge, rich arsenal of ideological lenses. And as a result of that, we know that if you admit that people aren't equal, those differences will be used to exploit the weak. We know that's true. Everywhere you look in our society, there's scams going on all the time. My email is just a relentless fire hose of scams coming at me. And I'm not the only one. My phone calls, I'm constantly getting phone calls claiming to be the Social Security Administration, and I have to give them my Social Security number, which the Social Security Administration says, we will never, ever call you up and ask you for your number. It is always a scam when someone does that. Or, the Nigerian prince who wants to give you millions, all you have to do is give him the bank account number. Won't that end well? So there is, we know, we don't like to admit it. It sounds unpatriotic, but we know that the way that modernity is constituted, if we are not treated as equal, then things will be organized around superiors and inferiors, and the superiors will exploit the inferiors, take everything that they have. We know that'll happen. We know it because it happens all the time. So this Greek perspective is scary. When I first started reading this stuff in Kenneth, I didn't like it at all. Of course, I was still carrying a lot of hippie stuff with me, but I knew it wasn't nice. It's not nice to say people aren't equal. But the truth is, it's obvious that we're not identical. I'm perfectly comfortable working in hospitals, working in karate. I'm perfectly happy being surrounded by people who are better at things than I am. That's just when I started working in my professional life, I was 17 years old, and I was working with people in their 50s and 60s. I've been used my whole career to being surrounded by people who are not my equals because they're my superiors, right? It's not actually that scary objectively. It's only scary because we know what our society will do with it. And so we start trying to argue whether what Kenneth is saying the Greeks said is good or bad, not on the basis of what it is, but on the basis of the messed up society that we're in and how it would exploit these differences. So this is fraught material to talk about. It's just very fraught. It's why, as Sharon said, you can't read this stuff and just skim over it. It's very dense. There's a lot being pulled in here. So, remarkable patterns of natural arete that ought to be respected. And we talked about that, right, in the first couple of sections in chapter 4. The Greeks almost worshipped arete. If young baby Phil turns out to have a predilection for art, the Greeks would have thought it was an obscenity not to let him explore that because he might have an arete for it. And if he does, that might develop into gifts that the society is going to need. And if the society runs around saying, no, everybody must be an accountant and a lawyer, all people have to be exactly equal and be the same, then our response is going to be to try to stomp out those inclinations in baby Phil when he's a little tyke, because he's not passing the test that we laid. The test that we laid didn't reward anybody for having the interests that would grow into artistic talent. Our test is testing for things like, can you be a competent laborer who can follow instructions? That's all we really want out of people. And anything beyond that, we start to get into No Child Left Behind risky territory. Well, you get a bad grade, you'll get tracked, your entire career, your entire life is now going to be on a different, direction. But in any case, even then, we're not going to let you develop artistic talent if we can possibly stop it, because it's not wanted, right? This is our problem. And it's part of why we have trouble understanding the Greeks in their own terms, because we read this stuff assuming they must see the world like we see the world, or like the people we're afraid of in our own society see the world, which they didn't. They saw the world very differently. So the Greeks saw two things. They saw these remarkable patterns of natural arte, which they considered nearly sacred and in need of encouragement and cultivation for the survival of society. But they also saw hubris or idiotist misevaluations where people do not know who they are. I'm the strongest man in the world, says the little kid. It's like, are you really? That's adorable. But I won't be, putting that to the test, because none of us believe you. We can see you have no idea how strong you are and how strong other people are. And, decisions about the future of society that involve strength should not be placed into your hands, or inevitable consequences will ensue. We can't have that. Need to be held in check for the sake of higher structures of order, right? There is a bigger picture beyond the, parochial self-adoration, self-infatuation of a small child. There are other issues at stake here. So, all right, that's the first sentence. So, to the Greek, society and economy must not commit violence against natural potential, coercing some by artificial dominion, and protecting others by naturally illegitimate systems of privilege. This is Aristotle, right? And there's a few other places this appears. I'm looking forward to finishing the book I'm reading on slavery among the ancient Greeks to see what evidence we have from the literature about who does or doesn't recognize the importance of this issue. It's possible for someone to be full of arete and yet suppressed by society. And Aristotle and some other Greeks considered that to be an injustice. And it's possible for people to hold an elevated place in society, and yet they themselves are just creatures of appetite or ideology who have no business being there, because now they're a hazard to everybody. They've got their hands on the steering wheel for the ship. The ship's in trouble. You can't let that person anywhere near the rudder or the steering. Get away. Go do something else, something that will, satisfy your natural inclinations, your preferences, and your self-limitations without, burning the place to the ground because of your liberated idiotism. So, in this, we're talking about the Greeks are wrestling with these issues of the paradox of freedom, which is that people who naturally self-enslave themselves, either appetitively or ideologically, are at their most enslaved when they are at their most free. When they are free to express their character is slavish. Not slavish in the sense of wishing someone would come along and put shackles on them. Slavish in the sense that they are essentially less of an individual and more of an expression of an appetite or an ideology. And as such, it makes them generic. I mean, when you've heard one spiel of a given ideology, you've heard them all. How many conversations do you need to have with people who come to your door and ask if you've been saved? I mean, after the first 2 or 3 or 4, you know how all those conversations are going to go, because those people are so ideologically driven that every time they open their mouth, some part of the ideology comes out, not anything new or different that's about them, or that's responsive to who you are or what your situation and interests are. Maybe there is a route for me to be saved, to achieve salvation, but it's not going to be by the standard reiteration of all the usual ideological crap, because I've heard it already. I'm too familiar with it. The same is true for, parochial appetite. If somebody just really, really needs the next shot of heroin, there's a limited number of sentences that they're going to say on their way to getting the goal that they want. And I've heard them. I grew up with them. I had a roommate when I was a little boy and I was in elementary school, 1st and 2nd grade. Our house had a number of rooms. It was a really dysfunctional commune, not a good example of hippie culture. It was really dysfunctional. One of the people living there was a heroin addict. He used to tell me every day was his birthday. He had balloons all his helium balloons in his room because they made him happy. It was something to look at while he was stoned out on heroin. And I didn't know that that's what was going on until later. But later in life, when I met other heroin addicts, they talk the same way because it's not a person, it's not an individual, and it's not an individuated person speaking. It's an appetite speaking. And the appetite is so laser focused, it only has so many things that it feels like saying, no matter which person it has possessed. So this is that issue about if you're going to have anything more than those two problems in society, anything more than the problems of generic appetites variously expressed or generic ideologies variously expressed, then you need to segment your society such that the people who are incompetent to do certain things should not be allowed to do those things. We believe that in medicine. Sharon is competent to be an anesthesiologist. You know who's incompetent to be an anesthesiologist? I am. I'm incompetent to be an anesthesiologist. And if I come to a hospital saying, hire me, I'll be a great anesthesiologist, you know, woe befall any patients of a hospital that believes me. You know, it doesn't matter how persuasive or charming I am. I'm a hazard. If I want to do it, that's the clearest sign I shouldn't do it because I don't have the backgrounds. So we do, when life and death are concerned, we are willing to admit that there ought to be some structures in society for the sake of higher order so that, you know, we don't all die in a fire. But when we start talking ideologically about what's the proper form of government, somehow we get sucked back into the orbit of, well, democracy is the worst of all forms, is the worst form of government except for all the others. We start spouting these thought-terminating cliches, and they cause us to become possessed and temporarily forget the hard-won wisdom that we apply in more serious concrete situations when we're not talking in abstracto. So this is the problem we have when we're reading this stuff. The Greeks are saying something that we absolutely don't believe in ideologically, but on a practical level, when we've got our wits about us, we really do believe in it, which is different people are good at different things. And you should not let people who are very bad at something do that thing except in a safe environment for learning. Anywhere else, it's a hazard. There's a lot of people you don't want running your nuclear power reactor. I mean, a lot of them. And that's the joke, right? In The Simpsons. Bart's not Bart, his father, Homer Simpson, is almost a classic example of somebody you do not want running a nuclear power plant. And that's why the author of that series makes him the guy who works at the nuclear power plant. It's insane to let Homer Simpson, you know, be sitting in that control room of a nuclear power plant. But that's who we are. We believe in equality. Everybody's just as good as anybody else, including the people who want to wreck everything. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, two related points, but one could also misunderstand one's abilities and be strapped by it. I remember when I was 6 years old, I was in first grade. I thought I was a fast runner, perhaps a misunderstanding, but that's what I thought. And so there was I guess a final session contest in, you know, in what you call physical education or whatever it is that in China was. And there was a series of things you could do, high jumping or whatever, you know. I thought, okay, I'll enter the race, okay? It was 100-yard race or 100 meters, I forgot. It was something of that sort. But I did not understand the concept of running a curve. And so when they put people on the various lanes, I happened to be put in the outside lane. So I wonder, like, why am I way ahead of all these people? And so I thought, well, I guess they must be giving me a handicap, like, because I was the youngest. So
Yes.
okay,
Yes.
but I know that I was fast. I'm gonna win easily
That's
with
right.
such a lead, right?
That's how it works.
So when I ran hard, and then I not only lost, I came in last. And really ruined my life in a sense because I really began to question. I thought I was fast, but God, I'm obviously very slow. I mean, like
Yeah.
even with the lead,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
lost.
Yeah.
And I always questioned that had a psychological impact on me.
That's right.
And I never really realized how good I might have been.
Right.
I was strapped by that misunderstanding because I just didn't understand the running of the curve. Okay.
Right.
And so, okay, transit. I was burned by that even later on when I was in high school. I ran cross country. I was always like, you know, I'm not a very good runner. Okay, that's fine. I accept that. There's a very great movie that I really love of Steve Prefontaine. You know, you're from the Northwest, you should know who Steve Prefontaine is. And it's a very inspiring. The movie is called Without Limits. It's about him, and actually it was very interesting. That was also the beginning of the development of the Nike shoes. His coach was part of that. So you saw both developments. And Steve Prefontaine was probably not a natural runner. He was good, but he wasn't that good. In the movie, he explained, well, how do you get so good at what you do? Because obviously you outran everybody, right? He said, when I was little, he was bullied by a bunch of people and he would run because he couldn't fight the ball. He would run. And he became a good runner not because he was a good runner, but he outgut them, like he just kept pushing beyond the limits of his ability and he lasted. And so it was very interesting that he became fast, not because he was naturally fast, although he was naturally fast, but he developed that because out of the fear of being beat up, he just kept running, running and running and running. Nobody had the guts to keep up with him. Okay, they all like, forget it.
Right.
And so, and the fact that in the Olympic Games, he lost. He lost to what's his name, the Finn, a very famous Finnish guy,
Lassi Viren.
Lassi Viren. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, who has blood dope, by the way, but nonetheless, Lassi Viren was a very, very good runner. Okay, and so he lost because he couldn't outgut Lassi Viren. Okay, but he really tried. He came very close apparently, and so it was his guts of holding up because he would just run fast from the beginning, and nobody would say, "Oh, this guy is a fool," whatever. But it turned out he wasn't fool. He was just keeping the pace so they wouldn't catch up. But Lassi Viren caught up with him.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, he wanted go to the next Olympic, but he died before then. But it's a very inspiring movie how you could actually even transcend your limitations.
I'll watch it.
Yeah, it's a very good performance too. And they also saw the development of the Nike running shoes, which is kind of the beginning of the whole thing. So
right.
Watch. You can overcome your inability to a certain degree. And he really transcended his abilities. I remember the first cross country that I guess he was still in high school. He ran, and somebody was betting on him, and well, whatever. And said, "Oh no, there's so many people." Like, forget it. After a little while, in the cross country, he was way, way ahead. This guy stopped paying attention, because he goes fast, he stay fast, and just waiting for people to catch up, and they never catch up. All right, that's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. I will definitely watch that. In our family, we love sports films, and we love other films that are examples of what we call competence porn. It's we like to see people struggling to do well and trying to overcome their limitations. It really warms our hearts. It's our one of our little peccadillos. So I will watch that film. I don't think I've seen it yet. When I was in high school, I in ninth grade I used to run cross country. I loved running everywhere, and it was for some of the same reasons, right? It was a way to avoid bullying, and it wasn't just that I was running away from bullies, but people who are on the edge and they might bully or they might not bully. they were more likely to bully if you were walking next to them than if you were blocks ahead and pulling away. So, I learned to run everywhere. People, even bullies, are typically too lazy to, you don't want to do that thing. And it was probably good for the bullies too, because they weren't committed bullies. I mean, they hadn't really done a lot of that stuff. And so by denying them the opportunity, they got to live a life in which they did less bullying. And many of those people grew up to become fine people, as I learned through the grapevine. They just were going through difficult stages. So yeah, all these issues that are here, this thing about, having different capabilities is one thing, right? That Steve Prefontaine has this capacity, that could develop into an arte, and he could become a great runner. You have this capacity to be an artist. Sharon has this capacity to be an anesthesiologist. Everybody on the call has their callings, their things that their own character resonates in response to when they encounter it, and they realize, I love doing this. I could really work on my limits and transcending them when it's this. Other things, maybe I'm not motivated, but when it's this, I'm willing to work for it and struggle, and thereby do better than I have before. So there's a whole wide array of human gifts that could be about. But this thing of human character types is trickier, because it's not as easy to measure as how fast do you run, or how well do you take in the overall impression of an artistic piece that you're creating enough to be able to develop it further. It's tough to figure out, and equally tough even in those areas of natural arte, as well as in these areas of distinctive character types. We can't know the ultimate teleology of the development of this gift. How far will it go? And the answer is, we never know in advance. We just don't. The only way to find out is to encourage people to grow in those directions and see what happens. And you can't make them have those talents if they don't have them. You can't make them want something they don't want. The contrary to the PR and advertising industry, there's limits to how far you can push people on this stuff. And this is what he's talking about in the next sentence when he says, humans, and this is something Donald mentioned like 2 or 3 weeks ago. And here we are at the sentence that he was highlighting. Human society does not produce the ultimate matter or resources of form that define character. Whatever that is in Steve Prefontaine that makes him willing and able to run, society couldn't make that happen, which is an abomination to modernity. The idea that people are not infinitely malleable, infinitely adaptable, infinitely programmable machines just waiting for society to stamp what we want on each of them. We hate that idea. And I don't mean individually. I mean, as a society, when we look at the structures of law and economics and everything else, they're all structured as though people are generic machines that can be trained to do anything. So with the proper education and the right application of, rewards in the form of money and punishments in the form of being hit with clubs or whatever, you can compel people through operant conditioning to create out of them whatever you want them to become. This is the core of modernity, this belief in the infinite adaptability and capacity of Homo sapiens. We talked about this at the beginning of this section, when we were talking about Pico della Mirandola and his myth, how he tried to rescue the medieval worldview by inventing this myth of God having given us this infinite capacity character, like Proteus, the ancient god who could take any shape. The problem is, it's been obvious for thousands of years that's not true. Kenneth, I can't remember if he does it in this book, but certainly in other places, including emails, he talks about how it was very interesting for him as a philosopher to have children, because any number of delusions you have about your power as a father are destroyed when you discover that different children want different things, almost seemingly from the moment they're born. Some of them are just want to be friendly and nice and hang out and want to please you, and others seemingly want to trip you and interrupt you and confound you at every turn. So you the first one might have liked piano, and so you try to give the second one piano lessons and they won't have it. You're like, well, I don't get it. What? You're supposed to be an infinitely malleable machine. Why? How can you want things so strongly that you simply refuse whole lines of development? And the answer is it suggests that the Greeks were more right about this than we are. We are not, in fact, a tabula rasa. And every political and economic theory in modernity that derives from the concept of the tabula rasa is thus on bad foundations. We've built on unstable ground. This is not the way people work. So it's not the way society works, which means it's not the way the human world is going to work, which explains why many, many features of the modern world don't work. We're constantly surprised by all the things that don't work. And we shouldn't be, because we're wrong at the fundamental level of the people who make up the society and what they are in their inner nature and inner character. We're not willing to accept the nuance of the Greek position, which is that as a whole, people are very malleable, but any individual person is only malleable to the extent that their character will allow them to be. They're going to want to grow in certain ways, whether they know it or not, whether you know it or not, whether anybody likes it or not. It's like he's using this metaphor in the very next half of the sentence. It's like playing poker. You've been dealt a hand of cards, and you can't change what that hand of cards is. All you can do as society is to make the best plays that you can with the hand that you've been dealt. So he says, and I'm going to call on Donald in just a second, human society merely plays the hand that nature deals it, generation after generation. Education and culture can feed or enhance the competence of each type, but they cannot endow primal drives or the talent or genius of arte. That comes from the nature of the people, and it has to be discovered. It can't be created from scratch. You can certainly snuff it out, but you can't, and everybody will be unhappy as a result. It's not actually going to go away. They're just going to be miserable their whole lives. And probably the society that contains the miserable person will also be miserable. But what you can't do is make somebody something that they're not. You have to just discover it and do our best to encourage it in healthy directions. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
When we commonly in our society give faint praise when someone steps forward and accomplishes something notable, we'll say, well, if they hadn't have stepped forward, someone else would have. There are these great men or women or what, just rampant throughout our society. And any time we face a crisis, if one of them doesn't step up, another will. And that's a caution here, that you kill off the future of your society by not, even if you have an educational system to support the development of this, you're open to these people appearing from any place within your society. Well, Fusus may just say, too bad. We're not giving you any, you're not getting any aces in this hand.
None for you.
Right, right. Yeah, well, that's, somebody will step forward and save us. Well, sometimes you lose.
Right. Frequently.
Frequently. Yeah. And that's all I want. You've made all these points. It's just sometimes I just don't think we see how this gets reflected, this attitude, in common things that we say,
Right. Yeah, the thought terminating cliches of our ideology encourage us to quickly reach the approved conclusion, and we do it so quickly that we don't stop to ask ourselves whether that's completely out of sync with what we were thinking just a moment before. The massive compartmentalization happens to people when we're possessed by ideologies, because we are thinking at the pace of someone driving on the freeway with their foot slammed down on the accelerator, not at the pace of someone walking through the countryside noticing every single thing. Harvey Manning, who's one of the authors of the first generation of books by the mountaineers who love to climb mountains and hike in nature. You can get them all over the Pacific Northwest easily. And I think they're available nationwide. They've gradually rewritten all these books to remove Harvey Manning's essays. So if you go back to the old editions, Harvey Manning was a crank. He was an old cranky guy who liked to hike in the wilderness, and he had observations about society and its defects that a lot of people didn't particularly care to think about, which is why they replaced all his text after he died, with something more fresh and modern and friendly and light and wouldn't bother anybody. And as such, it's a whole lot less interesting. But Harvey Manning used to say, if you want to increase the size of your world, you need to reduce the speed of your pace. Slow down and the world grows because you start noticing things. You're giving yourself more time to notice the things that otherwise you would have flown past. And the great virtue of ideologies and thought-turning cliches is the way they can jump you directly to a conclusion. But that's also their vice, because it means that you don't notice that along the way you have a deeply riven, compartmentalized, self-contradictory mind. You never stopped along the way to look around and go, wait a minute, all these other things I think are out of sync with this. Maybe I should question this. And of course, helping you to not question it is what makes it an ideology. As Kierkegaard says, that's how you know it's a delusion, is the fact that you're not, while in the grip of it, you can't think the things that you would have to think in order to notice that it was a delusion. The delusion hurries you past all the flaws. Don't just pay no attention. Look at the beautiful, look, it's ABBA, supergroup of the 70s. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
This question may or may not be addressed to Donald, but I guess in general. Like, I wonder how in the hell did the United States, and I guess the Allies in general, manage to find the right person, even though he was the wrong person in a certain way, of Eisenhower being the commander-in-chief. He certainly was not a superior general. Most people would agree that he was, at best, a mediocre general. But he was the person that was needed at that time to manage a lot of diverse egos that would have gone very badly if Patton or Montgomery, who were better generals, were in charge. How do we come up with that fact that somebody in a high power realized that, no, we did not need MacArthur or Montgomery or Patton as the leaders,
right,
although they were superior generals, but we needed a manager to create a harmony in the system.
We needed
How was that
George C.
possible? It's
Marshall.
interesting.
We needed George C. Marshall. He's the one that knew all these guys and put them in position.
That's
Right.
true. We should have had him.
He did need Bradley, Ridgway, Patton. He needed generals that could fight, and he needed generals that could do a lot of, smoothing things over with the Allies. We weren't going to win on our own.
Right.
That's right.
Right.
So Marshall was the one that actually understood that, is what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
That would have been a good choice if Marshall was ahead of that, but he was in the Pentagon. So yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I only went to 1 year of high school in Seattle at Rainier Beach High School, and then I moved to Walla Walla, Washington, which is in the lower southeast corner of the state and is a very rural place. It's much smaller than Seattle. You would think that I was reducing the quality of my education. It's certainly what I thought was going to happen. I was pretty angry about that part of it. But I lucked out because the generation before, there's a guy whose name I'm never going to remember, who happened to be an administrator in a Walla Walla school district. And the thing about Walla Walla at the time is they had more millionaires per capita than any other place in the United States, just because it was a farming town. I mean, their farms were worth millions of dollars, and they wanted their kids to have a good education. And so, this was before all the heavy ideology of the 80s and 90s and 2000s fell down on these places. So they could make reality-based decisions. And one of the things that they did is they appointed an administrator in the school district. I don't even remember exactly which position he held, who had a gift like Marshall had. He had a gift for the people. He knew what teachers' strengths and weaknesses were. And he ran around appointing strange people to positions. The English lit teacher at Walla Walla High School had previously been the coach. And this administrator knew him personally and saw that the reason he was a great coach was he had a gift for meeting kids where they actually were and figuring out what they cared about and showing them how the thing that he wanted them to do fit in with the thing that they wanted to do. And that was why they were good at sports. And Walla Walla High School didn't have, a good English lit department at the time. And so he set about finding a number of different teachers. And one of them was this coach who had no English lit background at all, by the way. And he said, but you like to learn and you're incredible at motivating people. So I'll give you some things to learn and then you go motivate these kids to learn about it. And it worked for, decades. That guy taught generations of Walla Walla people, really high quality English lit because he got them to care. And it wouldn't have happened without that administrator. And he wasn't the only one. The whole high school was full of these teachers who this administrator had picked out of nowhere. I mean, the guy who taught humanities and American lit didn't even have the degree to teach that stuff. But the administrator exempted him. Said, you've got the gift. You can teach. So he brought him in, and he was one of everybody's favorite teachers. And it was like that everywhere you looked. The physics teacher and calculus teacher, the guy who taught both of those subjects, who ended up being appointed by this administrator, he won Teacher of the Year for the entire United States 2 different years. He had a photo in his office shaking hands with President Gerald Ford. Walla Walla, Washington, in the middle of nowhere. The issue is what the Greeks called kairos, K-A-I-R-O-S, kairos, which means season. And they were recognizing, this goes back to the core of the Greek religion. Cornford talks about this. The cyclicity of the Greek religion was tied to the cyclicity of the seasons. And that when it's winter, planting isn't going to do you much good. You can be the most heroic farmer of all time and you'll still fail because it's winter. You can't plant now. But if you pay attention to when conditions are ripe, then you'll find the time to plant. And then even a fraction of the effort you would have expended in the winter trying to get a crop to grow, even just a fraction of that, you'll succeed in spades. So this is the course of human history, that for everything you're trying to do, there are times when you try as hard as you might, you're going to fail. But there's other times when those are the time you have to do the thing. Because if you do it then, you're going to succeed beyond your wildest dreams. And the things that cause seasons to happen in human affairs are more complex than the simple, revolution of the earth around the sun. But if Marshall is in the right place and knows the right people, then he can appoint people to where they need to go. Or this Walla Walla school district administrator knows the right people and can figure out who should be appointed where. And as a result, you get these little renaissances. And they happen throughout history. In all kinds of places and times, there are times when everything lines up and amazing things happen. And a lot of the success of when things go right in human history, a lot of it is owed to that sort of thing. The things that Sharon's dad taught his children about the nature of effort and striving and trying to be better and trying to educate yourself paid off in spades for any number of anesthesiology patients throughout Sharon's career. And that didn't just happen. It had to be cultivated at the right time by having someone like Sharon born who had the aptitude and interests that would eventually develop in those directions. That her father didn't squash those interests and try to make her do something else. Her father encouraged her to learn, and when she went forward and learned, she found her calling. It's the same that way for all of us. We're gonna, if we're gonna succeed, it's because a lot of things have to go right. That kairos has to create the necessary conditions. And this is what he's talking about in these paragraphs when he's saying society can't make these resources of character out of nothing. It can't do that. It doesn't create them at all. But if you luck out on nature's draw, nature deals the right hand in the population so that you get some people who by nature want to thrive and want to learn and excel. And if that's paired up with a society that isn't busy trying to homogenize everybody, but is willing to let people develop their differing gifts in their differing directions, that's when remarkable things can happen. The Greeks knew that. That was core to their politics. That's why they had terms like paideia and anthropoculture. So paragraph 7, right? Just carrying forward, this is what we're talking about here. To the Greeks, all acts, all living and all knowing, are undertaken for the sake of some good. That's a sentence that should if you've picked up the right Greek philosophy, that sentence should just sing out to you just as much as know thyself does. All acts are for the sake of some good. That's Aristotle. Of course, that's Aristotle. That's his thing. He says that relentlessly. And he's not the only Greek to say it, but he's obsessed with it. You know, if you want to understand nature or you want to understand people, you always have to ask yourself, for the sake of what good did they do that thing? There is some good that they perceived, that they were in pursuit of, that led them to behave that way. Even if it's unconscious. Conscious or unconscious, it doesn't matter. In this case, something in them wanted some good that led them in that direction. And so to understand the world, you always have to be asking yourself, what is the good that is being optimized here? Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I was just thinking, to back up a little bit, that what we might think of a person who could look at other people and say, you know, Rick's good at this, and Phil's good at this, and Sharon's good at this, and this is how I want to use them and position them and stuff. We might today look at that and say, well, that's just a terrible, abusive manipulator of people. You know, it's a very, we probably wouldn't say a lot of things. He puts people in little boxes. He keeps them there. You know, he limits their growth. You know, I only used Patton in the offense, never the defense. I didn't let him show his full set of skills as a general. You know, I don't know, you know, that somebody like Marshall might be judged today, although he's most historians that I've read don't do it that way, that he's kind of he's well thought of. But if you had a manager like that, would you think of him that way, or would you think of him constantly as somebody who's boxing you in, stunting your growth, doing something? And since you've got right to this next sentence too,
yeah.
When I read this, I wrote something in the margin for that, to know what is best for men to do. I just wrote there, all of philosophy in 9 words.
Yeah.
That's
the answer to Sharon's question.
Yeah, it is.
What is the point of all this? That's the point.
To know what is best for men to do.
Yeah.
And if you wanted to do it in 2 words, you could say Gnothi se auton, but
right.
You know,
right.
But that these themes in the Greeks just circle around and around without self-understanding and expending the effort to do it. You never make, you know, what it was like in Search for the Holy Grail. You never are able to choose wisely.
Right.
You know, to take the wooden cup.
He chose poorly.
Right. But that is life. Doing these things. And here, this is such a nice paragraph.
Yeah.
Y'all talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's right on the money. So if all acts, all living and all knowing, are undertaken for the sake of some good, then the whole point is to know what that good is, what is best for people. And as it says, the entire rationale for human organizing themselves into poleis, or political communities. It's the whole point of it. Because if we all just want to be infinitely free, then we could have no laws whatsoever and see what happens. No governance, no laws, let everybody be free. And what we quickly discover is that nobody's free because we're all in each other's way. You know, I'm busy trying to build something up while somebody else is trying to dig a hole, and we're doing it on the same spot, and neither of us is getting what we want. Even a modicum of governance to say, how about I dig my hole someplace else from where that guy's trying to build something, and then we can each get what we want. I mean, coordination is the nature of a social animal. Otherwise, with all our innovation, we're constantly getting in our way. You know, if we were a society of wolves, we could introduce innovation, and it wouldn't be that, I mean, we could do a freer society, and we would still be able to do innovation, because most wolves mostly want to do the same thing, which means that you can do your innovation somewhere that's out of the way of where wolves are going to do stuff. But with people, we're also different, and we get such harebrained ideas that there's no predicting what your neighbor's going to do. You know, if you just try to guess and then you try to take an action in the world, you know, it's like really flip of a coin whether you're going to avoid each other or get in each other's way. There's no way to know. We're too unpredictable. We need governance. The libertarian ideal of no governance at all, and we'll all just be infinitely free, and somehow a utopia will follow, is madness. You know, there's, you know, hundreds of thousands of years of evidence to the contrary. We have to be able to communicate with each other and coordinate with each other to at least keep out of each other's way, let alone help each other to achieve anything. So remember this concept of the Greeks, cosmos versus chaos. It's at the heart of everything. It's why they thought they were on top. It's why they were able to conquer the peninsula and rule it, because they were not a chaos. And the implication is, of course, you see in the mystery religions, like the Orphic religions, their cosmogonies and theogonies, they always say, before order there was chaos. We come into a picture that's full of free people getting in each other's way and crashing around and unable to accomplish anything. And we introduce a cosmos, and that cosmos is so much more effective than the chaos that we're able to conquer everything. And the entire peninsula is now ours. Right? That's, as a conquering people, that was what they understood to be at stake. So for them, the idea that let's all just be infinitely free and not coordinate our activities, that's just stupidity. That's slavish thinking. That desire for infinite freedom sets people up to have no freedom at all. That was the Greek assessment. And so what you want is not infinite freedom, but harmony. You want to harmonize each other's activities so that when you act in the world, more likely than not, you're going to have kairos, and your actions will be effective and not just undo each other and therefore be ineffectual. In my professional life, I've experienced both things. I've experienced times when our programming community was totally on its game and well harmonized, and we did amazing things and saved lives. I felt fantastic about it. It was a golden age. But I also lived through the agency capture that happened subsequently to the VA, when the entire community was basically carpet bombed and broken up into competing factions that never spoke to each other. And then it all dissolved into chaos, not in an abstract mathematical way, but literally in the way that means if you try to do good in the world, you can't, because other people are undoing your actions through the ways that they're trying to do good in the world. You're no longer harmonized with each other. You know, a whole pile of well-intentioned people can paralyze each other through simple lack of harmony. And when I say can, I mean did for decades. I mean, I've lived this life. So I'm a real believer in this particular tenet of the Greeks about the critical distinction between chaos and cosmos when it comes to human organization. And that's what's at stake here in paragraph 7. That's what he's talking about. Steve, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, the other elements of this section, character, yeah. But isn't opinion today telling us that character is a sure sign of insanity?
Right.
Sane people are infinitely agreeable. They are infinite putty for what we want them to be. Because, you know, in World War II, you had a couple of examples of character. You had Churchill, who we rate as a nutter. And yet, when everything was falling apart, he was the only one determined to stand up to the Nazis. The rest had their hands up. Let's give up today. Well, again, Patton was one of the few American generals which had any talent. You know, you can look at a book. German generals that were talented. It's like a telephone book. Soviet generals were talented. Quite a big page. Allied generals that showed talent. You know, Patton was one of the few ones. Patton was one of the ones the Germans feared. But we're still writing him off as a nut, which maybe is, but he had character.
Right.
Of course, you know, you had the Battle of the Bulge was a huge blunder on the part of the Allies, who liked to play it safe. They didn't like risk. You know, Patton was trying to say that you have to take risk occasionally. Even Montgomery took risk, but they'll say, no risk. But the Battle of the Bulge was pointing out to them that you can adopt this position of no risk, but the other guy's not going to play your game.
Right.
And yeah, this element of character that when the waves are come crashing in, people without character just fall over. The yes people, the agreeable people, they're not going to stand up to anything. They're only fair weather friends. But in regards to today, even this sophisticated society, which has so much machinery giving us so much stuff, starts to lack. And that's the problem I was indicating earlier. It's something Nietzsche obviously saw. We have a sandwich of technology and institutions, and the humanity in the middle has become a sort of a liverwurst paste to make the make the nice sandwich. And yes, one of the problems. We live in an age. Rudolf Steiner pointed this out. I've pointed it out before. I don't know who he stole the idea, and he said, "Don't you notice in World War I, when everyone's screaming socialism, we live in a very anti-social society, a society which is becoming increasingly antisocial. And the public is screaming, give us socialism. But they're not willing to look at themselves and say, well, maybe you need to learn to be more social. The people are not looking within anymore. They want answers on the outside. Give it to me on the platter. Give me freedom. How can you give a person freedom? That's something you have to inwardly obtain. You can take away the chains, but the mental chains are still there. And so I just wonder how many things. Socialism's an example. The public screaming out for socialism. What else do they want? What else is the public screaming out for? Because I think that's a bit of a clue as to what's missing. But they want it on the outside. They want it given the easy way. They don't want it on a path which requires internal change, which requires an internal challenge. And this is what advertising's preaching to everybody. Here it is on a platter. This product will make you great. No need to inwardly strive for anything. We'll just give it to you. I have heard this message before, and I'm starting to see why it's valuable now. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, this is what happens when we get to the late stage of an epoch. We don't want innovators anymore. We want people who will slot conveniently into the utility roles that we have available in our increasingly ossified society. And the last thing in the world we want is someone with character. Because if they got character, that means they're not infinitely malleable. They might resist our attempts to mold them. They might be a poor fit. So we always want, and you see this in job advertisement after job advertisement, we want team players. And team players means yes men. We want agreeable, nice, friendly, accommodating people who won't mind whatever the bosses have in mind or anybody else has in mind. They'll just go with the flow and do what's asked of them. And the problem is, many of the worst things that have happened in the 20th century were caused by people like that. This is what Hannah Arendt writes about. Ordinary people who lack character are a menace. They make themselves into utensils to be picked up and wielded by other people. And of course, what the Greeks are saying is, it's not, the modern term that we use, we say they lack character. But the Greeks say, no, they have a character. It is their character to be a yes man and to go with the flow. That's the problem. You can't build a society entirely off of people who, don't want to rock the boat or make any trouble. People have to stand for something, even if it's inconvenient to the forces that be. And the struggle between, an increasingly ossified society's inability to meet people's needs on the one hand, and the diminishing but still potent people of character who are going to object to that, that's where you start to get the struggles that lead towards the end of the epoch. I don't have any idea how this will go. There's never been an epoch like this where people had so much power to try to protect the status quo and to prevent growth. I don't think anybody would know what comes next or if we'll even get there. It's a great big mystery box. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I was just kind of surprised by what Stephen said about World War II. My father was fought in that war. He used to say that the real difference between us and the Germans that almost cost us the war was 200 men. And they were all German generals. Given the amount of resources they had they not had, or the lack of resources, had they not had such brilliant generals, he says, they were just, as an American, he was just surprised at how good they were all the time, even when they seemingly were beat. He used to joke. He said, if you're facing 3 Germans, they'll put 2 on the line, put 1 in reserve, and if you attack one of the guys on the line, the 3rd guy will counterattack you. And that they had a different view, and I don't know. It's neither here nor there, but he didn't wish they had won, but he as a soldier, he found them unusually competent at what they were doing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's Stephen's point as well, that the Germans had this whole book full of talented generals who were incredible. It's how one country could cause such a mess for all the other countries in Europe, is in part that density of talent, but of course it went hand in hand with, the pinnacle of technology in the world was Germany. The pinnacle of scientific education in the world was Germany. and strategic military thinking. I mean, ever since the creation of the Prussian juggernaut in the previous century, they've been working and working and working on developing and tuning up their strategies. So it kind of suggests, some of the potential that's involved in the inequities between people, that a small population could achieve so much, even if it was for the sake of evil, even if it was for a Holocaust and world domination, they still had that density of talent. And you can move mountains if you've got it, but if you don't have it, it's like Donald says, if you're in a historical situation and nature doesn't deal you any of that stuff to work with, and it doesn't matter how good your educational system is, because you can't create it from nothing. This is the challenge that the Greeks are talking about here. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Question of character. I think that's, in fact, I know, character is multifaceted. But there's one facet that stands out in my mind, and that's principled courage. And we live in a society today, especially when I look at the politicians, none of them have any character. They're also weak-kneed. And you kind of wonder, and I wonder, so why did you choose service if you are not going to serve or honor the interests of your fellow man? And so I'm asking, the question I have is, probably the most important facet or the most important parameter of a character is how you live out your principles, because that involves integrity, honesty, compassion, etc.
Yes. That's a very Greek idea that you just expressed.
Well, that's my naivete. I haven't been through my graphics yet. I'm coming on it.
Yeah, it's very Greek, right? I mean, they thought that's what was at stake and what it was all about. Learning the difference between principles and ideology, and learning to commit yourself to principles instead of ideology. That's the line between the Banausoi and the Aristoi, that you won't just fall for any thought-turning cliche that's persuasive, but you'll distinguish ideologies from the true principles that make a healthy character in a healthy society, like, love, truth, and courage. You'll focus on those things in order to develop them in yourself. You'll train yourself to do better at those things over time. But what the Greeks are concerned about is, some people are willing to do that introspection. They're willing to look at their behavior and say, I wasn't as honest as I should have been, and I need to figure out why so that I can do better next time. And other people aren't willing to admit that they're wrong long enough to figure out how to do better next time. They don't want to look at their own past behavior as bad. And if anybody else tries to encourage them to, instead of saying, this is a great opportunity for me to grow, they feel attacked and they get defensive. And thus they shut down their potential to develop those virtues in themselves, because they don't, to develop the virtues, you have to admit the vices, and they don't want to admit the vices. They've been punished too much for their vices, and now they can't see the potential growth that they could get out of it. They only see trouble, and they don't want it. So this is the thing that we're talking about, is we just don't know which children are going to grow up with that capacity for introspection and that desire to do better. And of the ones that are born with the potential to do that, we don't know which ones are going to have it snuffed out of them before they reach adolescence or adulthood, and which ones are those gifts going to survive long enough to really flower. There's a luck of the draw thing here, and you can try to make better families and a better society to increase the odds that when nature deals you an ace, it can grow into something, but you can't make an ace out of nothing. So that's why it's so important to have, fathers like the father you had, who consistently gives the message to the children the possibility of education, the possibility of improvement, the possibility of excellence, and the importance of those things, so that when those lessons find fertile ground, then they can take root, and those people who have that potential to grow can do it. This is what the Greeks are saying. This is what this paragraph's all about, is this issue. So I'm glad you brought it up, Sharon. Phil, what's on your mind?
Yeah, I'm probably a little bit more conservative in that regard. I mean, I truly believe in being self-critical and knowing who you are. But I think I quite often hold my inner character in reserve rather than hand. And in some way, it has to do with the fact that I feel like I live in a dangerous world that's always oppressing you. And when you come out and have your character manifest at hand, you're facing too many battles. And so therefore I hold it in reserve and wait for a moment when it's really, really necessary for me to come out my character in a full strength and manifest itself, or when the conditions are ripe enough for me to join in the manifestation of that. I'm not going to fight the battle alone. I'm just not going to do that. There's no reason for me to be a martyr and fight it alone to save a society that doesn't want to be saved. So therefore, I always hold that potential in reserve, both to protect myself and manifest it when I need it for my own good. But I'm always willing to join in when the conditions are amenable for me to manifest it beyond my own good. So that's a little bit selfish, I know, but I don't want to stick my head too far out and have it chopped off, because I run into that too often. The society, as it's manifested, is ready to fight against you because you are a threat. So I think hold it in the reserve is actually a wise thing to do in a society that doesn't encourage you to manifest it. So excuse my conservatism in that case. I'm actually a very progressive guy, but it's a very threatening society.
Yeah, everybody in this society has to learn how to do what you're talking about to some extent, because that's basic survival. I mean, mouthing off to the cops when they pull you over is a good way to end up in jail or dead. We gotta know, even if what they did is completely unfair and wrong, you can't make them be thinking the thoughts that lead down the path to, that's the end of me. So you can't say those words, you can't take those actions. We all have to learn that growing up to some extent. And of course, some people have to learn it more than others. It sucks to be a black man in America because
that might have been the fact that I did spend some time in communist China when I was young.
Right.
Also,
yeah. Right. Yeah, this is not the only country where you can get into trouble this way. That's probably always been the case. So there's always that ability to deceive. I mean, let's be honest, right? The ability to pretend to be someone harmless and not challenging authority and not rocking the boat, even though you're fully capable at other circumstances of rocking the boat and causing trouble and challenging authority. We learned that for our own survival, and we largely learn it in school from the relationship between the teacher and the students. So, how do you not end up in the principal's office is one of those lessons. There are always a few kids who never seem to learn it, but everybody else gets it. Sharon, what's on your mind?
I have a question for Phil. So Donald just finished talking about the 200 generals. So if you're going to keep your character inside, how do you ever lead? When do you become a leader? I mean, you say you don't want to get your head chopped off.
Well, I never craved the leadership position. I mean, once in a while, people want me to be the chair of something. I always want to be the advisor because second in command is always better because there's a layer of protection, you know. And I think you want to influence a situation, but leadership not only is it dangerous, but it's also too damn much work for me to do what I want to do.
Uh,
You know, it's like you get caught in administrative work, all sorts of things, you know, it's like, yeah, I want to do what I want to do and make it actually effective because I actually believe what I do is in the long run better for humanity than if I just became a leader or general in some position. But I'm always willing to give advice in some form. That's good. So part of the old Chinese literati, but not the emperor. Never want to be the emperor because I don't crave power in that sense. Yeah. Sorry if that doesn't please.
well, actually, it's not so much power as the opportunity to make a difference.
That's right. That's right. That's also important. I couldn't see myself as, let's say, Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. I really couldn't. I really admire them, particularly Malcolm. I really admire Malcolm. So I'm not going to be Malcolm.
It's just a, it's
No,
just a
look
different
elsewhere.
it's just a different approach, I guess, because what I did for a living is full of risk. So I guess every day it's a risk. You
Yeah.
know, you're trying not to kill a bunch of people,
Yeah,
right?
that's true.
And
I don't think I could take that responsibility that, you know, like this person might die because of me. I just that that's very difficult for me to take. Yeah.
okay, okay. I guess that's why I ask if you keep your character inside, when do you get to lead? When do you get to make a difference? And if you don't want to lead and you're a part of a team, when do you get to make a difference? Because every single member of that team has a role to play. You see, so I guess it's just a whole different approach. I was never a bystander. Got into lots of trouble, but I always believed that I could extricate myself, and I did. You know?
I can totally believe, Sharon, that you got into a lot of trouble. You have too much character not to get into trouble.
Well, for instance,
the principal's office was never a place I was afraid of.
well,
I tell you something, Phil. So when I was in kindergarten, or I guess we say first or second grade here, there's this little boy, and he always took my marbles. Every single recess, he took my marbles. And I would go home and cry, and my father would say, "What are you going to do about him?" I said, "I don't know." He says, "Well, you know, the day you take care of him, he won't bother you anymore." So the next day, I decked him, you know. And he called the principal, called my father, went to the office. In the car, drive home. My father never said a word to me. He just said, "How are you doing today?" I said, "Good." That was that.
That's right. Problem solved.
He never bothered me again. So the point I'm making here is I don't mind getting singed if I'm going to come out on a better side. And that's part of your character. And character, as I said, is multifaceted. It has many parameters and many expressions. And that's why we're a society.
well, believe me, when I push beyond the limits, I'm a samurai. You know, in other words, I don't mind dying as long as I take the other guy with me.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
Okay.
Stephen, what's on your mind? Come off mute.
I think part of the problem for the military is, you know, the Prussians had spent 200 years pursuing excellence. You know, to be somebody in Germany, if you're up in the upper classes, well, in East Germany, which the only thing they had was rather poor farmland, so they had rather poor farms. The only the only way to rise up in the world was to join the military, I guess. So all the Prussians, that was it. And they were pursuing excellence. The American military, well, in peacetime, that's just a place we send people that can't get along in normal society. So the American military, they had some money, had some equipment, and it was full of misfits. It sort of works till you're about to fight a war, and then you really got to pull your finger out. But we're seeing a situation now that's the West has gotten this crazy idea that their weapons and their technology is utterly superior to other people like the Russians, because they've been going around beating up tin pot countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. And, you know, I had this book 40 years ago, The New Maginot Line, where the guy was saying that this faith they have in the technological superiority of their weapons is going to be their undoing one day. And okay, they sent all the fancy weapons to the Ukrainians. Actually, it worked a little bit, but not well enough. And I can see it coming. I think Putin was trying to warn them, you know, Russia's been around for a long time, guys. And they're wondering why he's saying that. Why is he talking about the history? Is this man crazy? He spent half of an hour telling, look, guys, Russia's been around for a long time. We've been going for 1,000 years. Do you get it? And yet when I'm going around the Zoom groups and stuff like that, people are saying, oh, well, maybe we should dismantle Russia when we defeat them.
When?
Well, you're telling the Russians, I mean, I keep on telling them Putin has won because his fight wasn't with you. It was with the Russian people. He was looking for all the excuses to get on top of them. And you've empowered him.
War's a great excuse.
Yeah. And I'm afraid, you know, I used to look at all this military stuff years ago and I'm wondering, well, we've had Napoleon, we've had Hitler. Who's going to be the next idiot to try Russia? I forgot about Sweden, you know, Charles XII. He was before Napoleon. And they're going to go there, and it might not be in my lifetime, but they're going to suffer a huge reverse. I'm afraid the West is going to try to go to Russia and fight a war.
It's the Chekhov's gun of this story. We have to try it.
Yeah, and the West has got a lot of talent, but they're going to suffer one of those huge reverses. The West does have a huge amount of power. The trouble is they don't understand that people like the Russians who don't have quite that much power, they realise they're a lot more naked in this game. They don't leave things to chance as readily as we do in the West. We somehow think that our technology is going to save us. We can be idiots. It's all right. We can run around in circles. There's somebody else out there, or there's some committee, or there's somebody with a machine who's going to pull the rabbit out of a hat for us. That might all work until there's another country that wants to eat your lunch. They don't understand that. They don't understand that the Chinese want to eat your lunch. They think they're invincible. And yeah, I can see it coming. They're going to go up and fight against Russia one day. I know one day maybe they'll develop a technology that suppresses nuclear missiles. It's possible. And then they can go back to fighting the old style of war without any worries. But yeah, I've seen it coming for years. I thought, is it going to happen one day? The Americans are going to fight the Russians. They're going to try and do what the others did before. They're the only power around that's going to perhaps try and take on the Russians. And within my lifetime, I've seen it happen. I didn't expect to see it within my lifetime.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this 30 years ago.
Yeah.
After playing all these war games, who's going to be the next guy to come along and try it?
Yeah.
And maybe the planet's too small. I don't know. Maybe people are bored. Maybe they're just looking for trouble. I just don't fully understand the game that's being played. I'm only one little small human being. I have my limitations. Thank you.
It's ideology. It's ideology. The more this is what Nietzsche says when he says power makes stupid. This is what he's talking about. The easier a time you have in life because of your power, the more you start to believe you're superhuman. And you don't think it consciously, because then you would notice and think, well, that's stupid. Obviously, I'm not superhuman. But you start to act superhuman, as though things can't touch you, because other people are suffering from things you're not suffering from. You know, the problem comes along that trashes somebody else in their life, comes along to you, and you're rich and powerful. You just flex your wealth and it goes away. So you get used to thinking, I'm untouchable, right? It's like the level of adolescent development when they remember when they were so much weaker, and now it feels like they can do anything. And they remember when they weren't as smart and educated, but now it seems like they can read anything and think anything. And at that point, they start to think they're invulnerable, they're invincible. And the accident rate among adolescents is huge because they overreach. And they have to overreach. It's unless they've had a life that's very grounded in reality, it's the natural consequence of accumulation of power. In the United States, we are a very insulated society. I mean, we know fewer other languages than any other country on earth. You know, there's enormous numbers of us only know one language, and frequently not even that very well. We don't travel as much as people in other countries do. We're used to being in a bubble. And when you live in a bubble, you're out of touch with reality. You see your own ideologies reflected back at you from the surface of the bubble. You start to think the world is the way that your ideologies tell you the world is. So the United States is the land of freedom. Nobody in the world is free but us. And we're the land of science and technology and power. And we have the biggest military. We start to think that we're gods. And of course, same thing what happens to us that happens to an adolescent, which is, what's the good of having all this power if you don't use it? I mean, how do you know you have it unless you flex your muscles and prove, you know? So whether you're, you know, a 14-year-old pushing down 10-year-olds because you can, or whether you're a nuclear power going, isn't it a waste to have all these nuclear weapons and not use any of them? I mean, how do I convince everybody to be afraid of me if I'm unwilling to launch a nuclear weapon? There's all these kinds of things that are a form of madness, but that start to seem unconsciously persuasive when you have this kind of power and you haven't been given the opportunity to really flex. So we look back at history and we see, you know, Napoleon screws up in Russia, and we see, you know, Germany under Hitler screws up in Russia, and we think, well, we're bigger than they are. And of course, we can prove it, we think.
Well, let me say I simply disagree. I've been supporting Ukraine. I'll just say it that way.
Well, this isn't about right and wrong.
Yeah.
This is a different question Stephen's bringing up, which is, does the US think that it's reasonable to get into a war with Russia? I mean, it's one thing to do a proxy war like Afghanistan or Ukraine, but Ukraine is tipping. It's further away. It's not as proxy a war as Afghanistan was, right? There we were supplying the Mujahideen, and of course later they would blow up our buildings, but you know, these things happen. You know, but in the Ukraine, we're drawing ourselves and all of Europe closer and closer into direct conflict. And like, there's people on the ground in Ukraine who aren't Ukrainians who are involved in the fight against Russia. And you could be sure there's US people on the ground in Ukraine, not just our weapons. We're moving like in that direction.
Well, but we're supporting Ukraine in order to prevent a war between Russia and NATO and Europe. That's what it is. The blocking force to prevent them from going into Poland and to Lithuania and Estonia and so forth. I mean, that's the reason. We're not supporting them because we want to fight Russia. We want to prevent the more catastrophic war, which is between Europe, between NATO and Russia. That's the reason.
That's the conscious reason. And that's your reason. The question is that the reasoning of the generals at the Pentagon who have this amazing military, and they're the only people in the world with a military of this scale? You know, you got to ask yourself, when they dream at night, do they dream of not using it and merely having police actions? Or do they dream about winning? This is Stephen's not talking about right and wrong. Is it right that we fight in Ukraine? Is it wrong that we fight in Ukraine? That's not the issue. The question is, how realistic are American assessments of what's going to happen in the next 2-3 years in this conflict? Are not you and me, but the people who live and die for this field of work, the people in the Pentagon, are they having the same limited concepts of this conflict that we're having, or are they dreaming of eliminating a rival? And when you read Foreign Affairs and other, journals where people like this write articles, like Stephen says, they're right out in the open saying, when we beat Russia, let's break it up. That's what they're saying. Let's go in there and chop it into a bunch of little countries. They say it openly now. And you got to think, what is, that mindset is not the mindset of let's have a police action and protect Ukraine. That's the mindset of let's conquer the world. Sharon, go ahead. Come off mute.
I'm off mute. One of the things I want to say to Stephen, he said, the American military tends to be a bunch of misfits. I kind of disagree. I think the misfits stayed home because they had bone spurs, right? But I just want to say that history repeats itself. And if you understand it, you get a perspective.
Yes.
And there's a very, very bad, I am not a student of history. My education was very, very insular. It was all science once I decided. So I didn't get the broad perspective that the American education offers.
Right.
British education is very narrow. So I am learning history, and there's a very, very, very excellent 9-part documentary on Netflix, and it's called The Bomb and the Cold War. It is excellent. For me, probably it's excellent for me because my knowledge of history is not very good, but it talks about the original invasion of Poland and the consequences, and all the Baltic states and Russia under Stalin. And I learned a lot from it. I didn't know that he killed 1.6 million people too. I remember my dad putting the Gulag Archipelago on the table by Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Yeah.
And, I read a couple of chapters. I didn't understand what that was all about.
Yeah.
Now in 72, I'm looking at it and I remember the parts that he talked about. So that documentary, that 9-part series on Netflix is very, 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 very good. And what I see in it is the repetition.
Yes.
So whether the generals think they want to break up Russia, we've done it once already. Russia broke up when Ronald Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. Then Russia collapsed and all the Baltic states went back to being the Baltic states and not part of Russia, etc. So I think are we heading in that direction again? I don't know. Nobody knows.
Nobody knows.
Yeah. But that documentary is very, very good.
I'll read it. I'll watch it. Thank you very much. I didn't know about that. Yeah. Anyway, we don't obviously know what's going to happen here, but I think the core point out of what Stephen's saying that's relevant is this issue of how dangerous is it when your leadership is disconnected from reality? Like there's this guy, Edward Tufte, who makes books about how to present information, and he's like a demigod to those of us in the profession of trying to manage large amounts of information, because he's so crisp. He's right on the money about the ways in which you can confuse people by presenting information badly, or you can turn the tide of national events or international events by presenting information in such a clear, compelling way. And his favorite presentation is nothing he created. It's a map that was made after Napoleon's devastating defeat in Russia. And the map that he made it is both a map and a timeline and a graph of the population of Napoleon's army all at the same time. And it shows the path of Napoleon's invasion into Russia. And it shows his army dwindling and dwindling. And after each engagement at a city, how much smaller it is going forward. And in this one map, in one glimpse, you can see how and why and when and where Napoleon was defeated. It's not just an arm-wavy abstraction, but you can see how by the time he gets back to Paris, he has like, I don't know, 1% of the army that he started out with. They're just gone. They've been erased. And Tufte makes the point that to do that, to be able to, in one image, convey such enormously complex amount of information that's also vitally important, but easy to misunderstand, what it does is it helps to underscore the extent to which Napoleon was disconnected from reality. He had been too successful in Western Europe, and he started to think he was invincible. He knew he had better strategies, better techniques, better technology than all of the other generals. He knew that. And it led him to project this bubble around himself in which he foresaw the future not as it actually was, but in terms of these filters that had grown up because of his success. And it's why, you look at this map and you're like, man, the very first time he had a massive drop in the population of his army, he should have turned around because he didn't predict that. But he was so sure he was right that he disregarded the evidence and kept going. And you can see battle after battle, the shrinking of the line of the size of his army. That is probably the core issue that runs throughout this book that Kenneth has written about the problem, the way that it doesn't do you any good to be smart if you're disconnected from reality. And the structure of human intelligence is that half of our faculties have to do with disconnecting us from reality. And that's very useful for planning and identifying patterns and planning the future and deciding what it is that you want. We need this faculty. We couldn't be smart without it. But it's a two-edged sword that creates special kinds of stupidity in which the smarter you are, the more stupid the thing that you can do, because of how clearly you can project out the world the way that you imagine it to be instead of the way that it actually is. And so Napoleon does it. Hitler, he wasn't a crazy guy. He studied Napoleon's campaign extensively, and he thought he understood where Napoleon went wrong. When he went into Russia, he thought he had it all figured out. But he was blinded by the fact he'd been so successful in Western Europe. Same problem Napoleon had. And he takes that same exact mindset. Even with the additional information of Napoleon's catastrophic failure, he can't resist the candy. He's like, this ought to work. Surely this will work. And I haven't seen a map like the Tufte map of Napoleon's campaign that's equivalent for Hitler's. But we do know that although it was essential that all the Allies united against Hitler to stop him, we know that over half the battle was won on the Eastern Front. I mean, that was where there were the most deaths on both sides. Hitler's army was just destroyed when it went east. Sharon, go ahead, and I'll.
So I got a quick question before Donald. So the disconnection from reality in a leader, isn't that part of the dynamics of power?
Yes.
Because not only do you see it in churches.
Yes.
You see it in a lot of organization where the leader gets, I hate to say this word, blinded by his own success.
Yes.
So
yes.
I think that disconnection from reality, and please correct me, is part of the dynamics of power.
Yes.
And one of the ways I think you can manage that is to have people around you that you do listen to.
Yes.
That you give them credibility.
Yes.
that they listen to.
That's right. And you can't create hierarchies with so many levels that your leaders are entirely, that they don't do any hands-on work anywhere, that all they do is lead. Perfect, pure, full-time leaders are a disaster because they're in a bubble. It's too easy to have lost everything. It's why in the Horatio Hornblower stories, for all that they're sort of wishful thinking, these, this sailor who rises from nothing to, preeminence within the stories. The best thing about them is the idea that the reason he was able to be that good was that he started out at the bottom of the rung and he had to do every job on the ship. By the time he climbed to the top of the ladder of his ship and was in charge, he knew all the jobs, and not in an abstract ideological way. He knew them, under his fingernails from his blisters and scars. He did them. So when he gave an order, it didn't come out of La La Land or ideology. It came from knowing somebody has to do this thing or we're going to be in the specific kind of trouble. That's the thing that you need to do with your leaders. And that's why as an epoch wears on, rises to its peak and begins to senesce, part of the process of that is the ossification into classes. You get people who have never lived the life of having the dirt under their fingernails, but somehow they're supposed to be wise enough to make decisions about those things. Of course, they're not. They don't have the experience. They don't have the gnosis that's necessary to leash their noesis. So this and the point, that these paragraphs are making in this Kenneth Smith, text that we're reading is that some people cannot go back to the dirt under their fingernails. They're characterologically incapable of it. They just have no interest at all. Their whole character drives them away from concrete reality and into the purest, most logical expression of their ideologies that have captured them. And they believe that that's success and that's all that they want in life. You can't let those people lead. They're going to be a catastrophe. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Trouble finding the right icon. Well, I'm about where the Ukrainian war is going. One, I find it very upsetting. But one of the most upsetting things I found is that early on in that first few days when Russia attacked in 2022, Lloyd Austin, our Secretary of Defense, said, gee, what if we could turn this into an occasion for bleeding Russia for a decade? I have never heard such a cynical view. That the last thing from the Pentagon perspective seems to be, we don't want Ukraine to win, at least not quickly. They can win slowly. We want to track all the equipment counts, and when Russia can't lose until they've lost, or Ukraine can't win until Russia has lost so many men, so much equipment, whatever. I don't know how you do that calculus that, well, for the greater good, 200,000 Ukrainians are going to have to die because we got to win this thing slowly. Incredible cynicism.
Yes.
I don't know. Tell you the truth, it could have been probably won in 2014 by putting a regiment in Crimea and seeing if Russia would come across that strait. I suspect they wouldn't have.
Right. Right. They don't want to be in a nuclear war.
No. And
that's why we didn't put them there.
No.
Right? Because, like you say, there is this horrific calculus that doesn't get reported in the papers that's happening behind the scenes where people are dreaming of exhausting the Russian military by throwing Ukrainian bodies at it. It's It reminds me of the way that Roosevelt played footsie with the Japanese long before Pearl Harbor. He believed that for the US to dominate the Pacific, we were going to have to take on Japan, but he couldn't convince the American public to just directly enter a war. So instead, behind the scenes, he maneuvered, blocking access, Japan's access to various like rubber or iron. I mean, Japan is poor of a lot of basic natural resources, and they needed to be imperialist if they were going to be a dominant military power. And so Roosevelt starts hemming them in and cutting them off. And he knows the end game. He may not know that they're going to, bomb Pearl Harbor specifically, but he knows that the end game is an enormous amount of misery and a gigantic war. And he's trying to bring it on because he believes it's inevitable. And he'd rather it happens under his terms than under the Japanese terms. But we still don't report it that way because nobody really wants to talk about the idea that we deliberately provoked a war in order to exhaust a nation to keep it from being a competitor with us.
Well, it's almost like Friday I went and saw Dune Part 2. There's going to be a big, exhausting war that will leave all the great houses pretty well screwed over. that this things that seem like we're going to get freedom for these poor oppressed people turns out to, well, actually we're going to use their predicament to pursue imperial aims. I don't know. It would be hard. It would be hard for me to say I could fight in that war.
Isn't that what we've always done? That's what we've always done, no different.
In modernity.
Yes, you see that in that documentary that I was watching. That's not a new thing. I correct me if I'm wrong.
Maybe the last righteous war was chasing Pancho Villa around northern Mexico. No, I don't know that all wars are quite that cynical. As well, let's put it this way: I have watched that video of Lloyd Austin saying that because I just couldn't believe it. But you can go back and search for it, and he really said it.
Really said it.
But I couldn't imagine Marshall saying it or something, I mean, I think they would have said, we're going to beat them as quickly as we can, at least.
Right.
And then it's like, you couple that with, well, we've given them 30 tanks and we can give them, 200 Bradleys and they can have 2 Patriot missile, and then you say, yes, this will keep them from losing for several years. Wait a minute, that's our plan. Just, if you, I don't know. I think it's amazing. Well, not amazing. It's not amazing. One country that I find, there are several countries that speak very clearly about that conflict. Czechia, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia.
Yeah.
They all say, those are some bad dudes over there. You get a chance to fight them, do it and do it well.
Right.
Don't play around. Because if you play around and miscalculate, it will be bad. We know how bad it will be.
Yeah. They're at risk.
They're the one, we're on the front line and they will overrun us before anybody gets here. All right, enough. Let's
Well, we got to wrap up because we're at the end of our day. Phil and Stephen had some things they'd like to add, and maybe if it's brief, We can do that, but we've got to wrap up for next week. So go ahead, Phil. What's on your mind?
Well, I think the problem is that it's a stone meeting a hard place. Because I think both situations are existential because Russia really need the blocking force that's within Poland and Romania. And that means, in a sense, destroying, invading Europe. And the problem is that it was set up in the World War II because World War II really was a convenient unity alliance against Germany. And at the end of the World War II, it's important to note that Russia took a sweet time going to Berlin. They could have gone there much earlier. It took a sweet time because Stalin wanted, in a sense, to sweep over all of Eastern Europe in order to own the property. And in fact, particularly in Poland, when they were heading there, the Russians were still invading Warsaw. And the Polish resistance was very anxious for the Russians to come in and beg them to come in. And Stalin commanded General Zhukov, do not go in until the Russians finished, until the Germans finish their job killing the resistance. Then we'll come in and sweep away the Germans. In a sense, he was drawing a borderline in order to conquer all of Eastern Europe. So that would be a problem. So that's a leftover war that was never settled. In other words, was settled in time, much of Eastern Europe would not be part of Russia, satellites, including Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. And so in some sense, this is a leftover thing that was never settled. So it goes back to actually the end of World War II, because they did not want to finish the war fast enough because they wanted to take their time to conquer all of Eastern Europe. That's the truth of the matter, and that's why we're left over with the fact that after certainly Poland, at the end of the Cold War, became independent, they needed Poland back. And that's where the blocking force is that Russia needs existentially to continue without being invaded by the Germans and the French in history and many others that went through that gap. And it was only that gap and the fact that the Russian winter was the thing that defeated both Napoleon and Hitler. It was the winter, and they needed that landmass to sustain them. That is actually the defense, the gap and the landmass and winter that actually prevented them from getting into Moscow. That's the reason Russia will not stop. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Phil.
Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind, and then we'll wrap up.
I think the huge problem is what we're talking about here is a misunderstanding of character. And America, I went to Vietnam, you had Montgomery. He said that these Oriental peoples don't think they're inferior. This is his big message. They see themselves as the inheritors of an age-old civilization. They believe in themselves. They think that they're just as good as you, to the shocked American faces. What? We're the best in the world. Everybody wants our stuff. Come, what are you talking about? You're mad. Everyone said Montgomery was mad.
But he was
Now,
right.
the West could win this particular war. They could push the Russians back. Yeah, sure. But this other plan they got of dismantling Russia, they don't seem to understand the Russians have a different character from America. They don't, this isn't being comprehended. It's the old story. Vietnamese, they're wrong, but in them, they can be salvaged. There's an American just screaming to get out. Afghanistan, there's an American just screaming to get out. This is this constant mentality. And yeah, they don't understand they could win this conflict. But there's something in Russia they don't understand. They're different. They're aliens from another planet. If you really want to get that message. Now I can understand the purpose of it. Russia is the only other power with a large amount of nukes. We knock them out, we'll have the rest of the world singing our tune. And obviously, in all your secret services, in the CIA and the whole lot, we now have a lot of yes people, secret yes people, who lack character, and they're playing the game. They've lost that insight. Look, Russia's a different place. You went to Holland and you discovered this is different. There's a different psyche here. It's not the same as us.
Mm-hmm.
They don't seem to have that understanding. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. Well, so mostly we did a sidetrack for the last half hour on Ukraine, and it's understandable because it's scary. But next week we'll pick back up and finish off paragraph 7 and move on. It's obviously relevant. We're talking here about why do human societies exist and what is the purpose of them and how should they be organized, and we're trying to get to what the Greeks thought about that. And I think wrestling with these questions about the Ukraine is it's not irrelevant to this. But I think we've covered this for now, and next week we'll dive more directly into the text.
Well, I'm sorry that we got into Ukraine, but nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole world is sorry that this is going on. One of several things happening right now that all of us wish was not happening. But it's all right. So yeah, next week we'll pick it up again. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Rick. Sharon, keep reading Snyder. He's great on Ukraine.
Oh, which one is this?
Timothy Snyder.
Which book is it he's reading? Which book?
Since you like YouTube, go find his lectures on the history of modern Ukraine.
Okay, I will. Have a great week.